Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting into the shadows of 1987, where a new pizzeria opens its doors with bright lights and cheerful faces, unaware of the darkness that already waits in the back room and the tragedy that will soon unfold during one final birthday party. This is the story of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, a tale that plays out across one terrible week in November, where shiny new animatronics patrol halls lit by flickering monitors, where older, broken machines sit forgotten in storage rooms, and where a mysterious puppet watches over everything from its music box prison. Born from the ashes of a previous location, rebuilt with modern technology and hopeful promises, this pizzeria becomes the stage for another chapter in William Afton's bloody legacy. From the first phone call welcoming a new night guard to his final shift on a day that will be remembered forever, we'll trace every moment of this doomed establishment, exploring the cheerful toys that hide aggressive programming, the withered shells that carry tormented souls, and the puppet whose tragic origin story connects all the pieces together. Whether you're uncovering these details for the first time, revisiting familiar territory with fresh perspective, or simply letting the narrative wash over you like a gentle tide as sleep takes hold, this will carry you through the complete and unbroken lore of Five Nights at Freddy's 2. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this same story reaching different corners of the world, one quiet night at a time. Let's begin. The Revelation, a prequel unveiled. When Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was first released in November of 2014, just 3 months after the original game captivated horror fans everywhere, players naturally assumed they were stepping into a sequel, a continuation of Mike Schmidt's horrifying experience at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The game's title certainly suggested as much. The number 2 implied forward progression, a next chapter in an ongoing story. Yet as players dove into the game, examining every detail, analyzing every phone call, and scrutinizing every paycheck, a stunning realization began to dawn. This wasn't a sequel at all. Despite being the second game released in the franchise, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 actually takes place before the events of the first game. This revelation fundamentally changed how fans understood the Five Nights at Freddy's timeline, transforming what seemed like a straightforward horror story into something far more complex and interwoven. The evidence emerged slowly but decisively. The paychecks that appear at the end of nights 5 and 6 don't just show the meager wages paid to night guards. They display specific dates. November 12th, 1987. November 13th, 1987. These dates place the game firmly in the late 80s, years before the first game setting in 1993. But the timeline placement went deeper than simple dates on paychecks. Phone Guy, who meets his demise during the first game, is alive and well throughout Five Nights at Freddy's 2, offering helpful advice and information across 6 nights of recorded messages. His survival alone indicated that these events must precede his death in the original game. The animatronics themselves told a story of temporal placement. The shiny new toy versions with their bright colors and modern features were clearly newer models, while the original animatronics from the first game sat broken and deteriorating in a back room, labeled as the withered animatronics. Their decrepit state suggested they had been sitting unused for quite some time, waiting to be refurbished into the versions players encountered in the first game. Phone Guy's dialogue reinforced this timeline placement in subtle but important ways. He mentions that the old location had been left to rot for quite a while before this new pizzeria opened, establishing that there was a previous Freddy Fazbear's Pizza before the one we're working in during Five Nights at Freddy's 2. He refers to the animatronics from that location, the ones sitting in the back room, as characters from the old place, confirming they're being stored rather than actively used. Most tellingly, he never mentions the Bite of 87 as a past event. In the first game, Phone Guy references the bite as something that already happened, explaining that it's the reason the animatronics are no longer allowed to walk around during the day. The fact that he doesn't mention this restriction during Five Nights at Freddy's 2 and actually notes that the toy animatronics are allowed to walk around during the day proves that the infamous bite hasn't occurred yet. This temporal positioning isn't just a clever twist. It recontextualizes everything players thought they understood about the first game. Suddenly, the decrepit state of the animatronics in the original Five Nights at Freddy's makes more sense. They weren't just old, they had been through at least 2 locations. First, as the main attractions at an earlier pizzeria, then relegated to the parts and service room during the 1987 location, and finally refurbished one more time for the final 1993 location, where Mike Schmidt encounters them. The setting of November 1987 carries its own weight of inevitability. Players familiar with the first game knew that something called the Bite of 87 had occurred. An incident so severe that it changed the rules for how animatronics could operate. Now, playing through Five Nights at Freddy's 2, we're experiencing the week leading up to that defining moment. There's a terrible dramatic irony in Jeremy Fitzgerald's shifts, in Phone Guy's increasingly worried calls, in the newspaper that announces a birthday party at the end. We know that something horrific is coming, that this bright new pizzeria, with its advanced technology and safety features, won't survive past this single week. But the characters living through these events don't have that foresight. They're trying to make the best of a difficult situation, hoping the new location will succeed where the old one failed, unaware that they're racing toward a tragedy that will define the franchise's lore for years to come. This prequel structure also established a pattern that would continue throughout the Five Nights at Freddy's series. Creator Scott Cawthon wasn't interested in telling a linear story from beginning to end. Instead, he scattered the narrative across different time periods, challenging players to piece together the chronology themselves. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was the first hint of this approach, the first indication that understanding this franchise's lore would require careful attention to details, a willingness to question assumptions, and an acceptance that the release order of the games would rarely match their chronological order. The revelation that Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was actually a prequel opened the door for future games to jump around in time, exploring different eras of Fazbear Entertainment's dark history without following a predictable path. The new location, hope built on haunted foundations. In November of 1987, Fazbear Entertainment attempted to distance itself from a troubled past by opening a brand new location, a fresh start that promised to leave behind the shadows and rumors that plagued previous establishments. This wasn't their first pizzeria, not by a long shot. There had been the original Fredbear's Family Diner back in the 70s, followed by at least one Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location that had closed under mysterious circumstances. That previous location, the one Phone Guy refers to as the old place, had been left to decay for quite some time before the company decided to try again. The reasons for its closure remain somewhat ambiguous in the phone calls, spoken about in vague terms that suggest something unpleasant occurred, but the exact details are left to shadow and speculation. What we know for certain is that the original animatronics from that location, Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie the Bunny, Chica the Chicken, and Foxy the Pirate, along with the mysterious Golden Freddy, had been moved into storage when the new location opened. They sat in the parts and service room, stripped for spare components, their once cheerful appearances now reduced to exposed endoskeletons, missing limbs, and the haunting emptiness of machines left to deteriorate. The new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in 1987 represented a significant investment from Fazbear Entertainment, an attempt to rebrand and modernize. The company had spent what Phone Guy describes as a small fortune on new animatronic characters, upgraded versions designed to be more child-friendly, more technologically advanced, and theoretically safer than their predecessors. These toy animatronics featured facial recognition technology connected to a criminal database, allowing them to supposedly detect potential predators from a mile away. They had advanced mobility that let them walk around during the day, interacting with children in ways that previous animatronics couldn't. On paper, this was the future of family entertainment, combining the nostalgic appeal of animatronic performers with cutting-edge safety features. The pizzeria itself was larger and more elaborate than previous locations, with the multiple party rooms decorated for celebrations, a prize corner where children could exchange tickets for rewards, a show stage where the toy animatronics performed, and even a Kids Cove area specifically designed for one of the new characters. Yet beneath this cheerful exterior, problems lurked from the very beginning. The most obvious issue was the presence of the old animatronics themselves. Fazbear Entertainment hadn't disposed of them, hadn't completely moved on from the past. Instead, the company kept them in storage, attempting to retrofit them with some of the newer technology, perhaps hoping to eventually bring them back into service. This decision to maintain the old characters while introducing new ones created a strange duality within the location, a physical representation of the company's inability to fully escape its history. The withered animatronics sat in their dark room, surrounded by spare parts and forgotten components, but they weren't completely inactive. Something about them, some lingering presence or programming quirk, caused them to move at night, to wander the halls alongside their newer counterparts. Phone Guy mentions this phenomenon with a mixture of confusion and concern, unable to explain why animatronics that should be powered down are instead roaming the building after hours. The building also operated under an ongoing police investigation, a fact that Phone Guy mentions in carefully vague terms. He advises Jeremy not to worry about anything he might have heard, that any rumors are likely blown out of proportion. But the fact that an investigation is happening at all casts a shadow over the location's opening. We don't learn the full details of what prompted this police attention during the initial phone calls, but the investigation's presence suggests that something serious has already occurred or is suspected to occur. This police involvement adds a layer of tension to the entire week, a sense that authorities are paying attention, but perhaps not close enough, not quickly enough to prevent what's coming. The pizzeria is simultaneously trying to project an image of safety and fun while dealing with the reality of law enforcement scrutiny, a contradiction that manifests in the gap between Phone Guy's cheerful reassurances and the increasingly dangerous situations Jeremy encounters each night. The layout of this 1987 location was designed with function and entertainment in mind, but it would ultimately serve as a stage for tragedy. The show stage sat prominently near the entrance, where Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, and Toy Chica performed their routines during operating hours. The prize corner occupied its own distinct area, home to the puppet, who would play a critical role in the location's story. Multiple party rooms allowed for simultaneous birthday celebrations, maximizing the pizzeria's capacity and revenue potential. The Kids' Cove provided a dedicated space for Mangle, an animatronic that children could interact with more directly, taking it apart and putting it back together in what was meant to be a playful feature, but resulted in the character's perpetually mangled state. The main hallway connected these various areas, and along that hallway, small drawings made by children decorated the walls, innocent crayon illustrations that would take on darker significance as the week progressed. At the back of the building, away from customer areas, the parts and service room housed the withered animatronics in their deteriorated states, a reminder of past failures hidden away from public view. And in the center of it all, the security office, a cramped space with no doors, where Jeremy Fitzgerald would spend his nights armed with nothing but a flashlight, a Freddy Fazbear head mask, and a monitor system that never quite showed him enough to feel truly safe. This location represented Fazbear Entertainment's attempt to move forward, to create something new and successful built on the bones of what came before. The company invested heavily in new technology, in advanced animatronics that seemed to promise a safer experience for both employees and guests. They tried to distance the new location from whatever had happened at the old one, though they couldn't quite let go of the past entirely, keeping those old characters in storage just in case. But the foundation was already compromised. You can't build something clean and pure on top of tragedy without that darkness eventually seeping through. And in November of 1987, over the course of one terrible week, all the bright promises and safety features would prove insufficient against forces that had been set in motion years earlier, when Charlotte Emily died alone in the rain, when 5 children were lured to a back room and never seen alive again, when William Afton discovered that death wasn't always the end. The new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, for all its modern improvements and hopeful beginnings, was doomed before it even opened. The toy animatronics, bright faces hiding dark instincts, the toy animatronics represented a bold reimagining of Fazbear Entertainment's iconic characters, taking the basic concepts that had defined the brand since the early days and updating them for a new generation. These weren't simple refurbishments of existing machines. They were complete redesigns from the ground up, built with modern technology and aesthetic sensibilities that prioritized a cuter, more approachable appearance. Where the original animatronics had carried a certain heft and edge to their designs, elements that made them impressive, but perhaps slightly intimidating, the toy versions leaned fully into child-friendly appeal. Larger eyes conveyed innocence and friendliness. Rounder proportions softened their silhouettes. Brighter colors popped against the pizzeria's decorations. Everything about their design screamed safe, trustworthy, fun. Parents could feel comfortable leaving their children in the same room with these performers, assured by the visible signs of advanced technology and the company's promises about built-in safety features. Yet beneath those cheerful exteriors, something had gone wrong. Programming quirks or supernatural interference that transformed these symbols of modernization into threats that wandered the halls each night, hunting the security guard with single-minded determination. Toy Freddy stood as the leader of this new band, the upgraded face of the franchise itself. His design maintained the core elements that made Freddy Fazbear recognizable: the brown bear shape, the top hat and bow tie, the role as friendly mascot and ringleader. But where the original Freddy had a certain worn charm, toy Freddy embraced a more polished appearance. His plastic casing gleamed under the pizzeria's lights. His bright blue eyes sparkled with program friendliness. His rotund body suggested cuddliness rather than menace. During operating hours, he'd stand on stage alongside Toy Bonnie and Toy Chica, performing songs and entertaining children with the mechanical precision that Fazbear Entertainment had perfected over years of operation. Parents saw him as the safe, recognizable face of a beloved children's entertainment brand. Children saw him as a friendly character to sing along with, to take pictures with, to receive prizes from during birthday celebrations. But at night, Toy Freddy became something different. He'd leave the show stage and begin moving through the party rooms, his movements purposeful and directed. His behavior at night stood in stark contrast to his daytime role, exhibiting an aggression toward the night guard that couldn't be explained away by simple programming errors. According to Phone Guy, the toy animatronics were specifically designed with facial recognition technology tied into a criminal database. This system should have allowed them to differentiate between employees and potential threats, should have prevented them from attacking staff members who belonged in the building. Yet Toy Freddy, like his fellow toys, seemed unable or unwilling to make that distinction after hours, treating Jeremy's presence as something to be corrected through violent means. Toy Bonnie maintained the character's traditional role as the guitar-playing member of the band, but with significant visual updates that gave him a distinctly different appearance from his withered predecessor. Where the original Bonnie was a deeper purple or blue depending on lighting, Toy Bonnie adopted a much brighter, almost cyan blue coloration that seemed designed to appeal to younger children. His design was noticeably more feminine in some aspects, with longer eyelashes and a slightly more delicate build than the original. The guitar he carried was also updated, a cherry red electric guitar that matched his more modern aesthetic. During performances, Toy Bonnie would stand to Freddy's left, strumming along to pre-programmed songs, while his head would occasionally turn to take in the audience, his movements smooth and fluid in ways the older animatronics never quite achieved. Children could see him up close during walk-around interactions when the toy animatronics would leave the stage to mingle with guests during operating hours, a feature that was specifically marketed as a selling point of the new location's more advanced technology. Yet that same advanced mobility became a liability at night. Toy Bonnie proved to be one of the more active threats during Jeremy's shifts, frequently making his way through the vents that connected various parts of the building. His pathway took him from the show stage through Party Room 3, then Party Room 4, eventually reaching the vent systems that led directly to the security office. The Freddy Fazbear head mask that Jeremy relied on for protection could fool Toy Bonnie, temporarily convincing him that the night guard was just another animatronic rather than a human to be dealt with. But that protection only lasted as long as Jeremy kept the mask on, remaining perfectly still, while Toy Bonnie stared with those blank, searching eyes. Toy Chica completed the show stage trio, taking the character concept of the backup singer with a cupcake companion and giving it a significant makeover for the 80s audience. Her bright yellow coloring was more vibrant than the original Chica's, almost neon in its intensity. Her build was noticeably curvier than the original, with a design that some fans noted seemed to lean into a more teenage or young adult aesthetic, despite being a character primarily marketed toward children. Her bib, instead of reading "Let's eat," like the original Chica's, proclaimed "Let's party," with bold lettering, emphasizing the celebration aspect of the pizzeria's brand. She carried her cupcake companion as always, though this version looks slightly different from the one that came with the original Chica, featuring its own set of distinctive eyes and a more elaborate frosting pattern. During operating hours, Toy Chica would perform alongside Freddy and Bonnie, her movements choreographed to complement theirs in the band's routines. But between performances or during walk-around time, she had a peculiar quirk that became somewhat disturbing when viewed through the security cameras at night. Toy Chica would lose certain parts of her costume during her nightly routine, her eyes and beak mysteriously absent as she moved through the building. This transformation from cheerful performer to hollow-eyed figure created an unsettling contrast, a visual representation of how the animatronics changed between their daytime and nighttime behaviors. Like Toy Bonnie, she made extensive use of the vent system during her nighttime activities, approaching the security office from the left side of the building through a pathway that took her from the show stage through the main hall, then through party rooms and eventually into the left vent. Jeremy would need to watch for her arrival carefully, keeping track of her position through the camera system and using the vent lights to check for her presence just outside the office. The mask could fool her, but only if applied in time, before she had a chance to confirm that a human was sitting in that office chair. Mangle represented perhaps the most unusual addition to the toy animatronic lineup, a character that embodied both innovation and failure in equal measure. Originally designed as a rebuilt version of Foxy, she was meant to occupy the Kids' Cove area, a dedicated space where children could interact with her more directly than the other animatronics. The gimmick was simple, but engaging for young guests. Mangle could be taken apart and put back together, allowing children to play with her construction, to disassemble and reassemble her in an interactive experience that went beyond simply watching an animatronic perform. In theory, this was a brilliant way to engage children's curiosity about how the animatronics worked, turning the mechanics into a game rather than something mysterious and potentially frightening. In practice, the constant taking apart and putting back together proved too much for Mangle's systems to handle. Children would pull her apart with enthusiasm, but lack the knowledge or care to properly reassemble her. Staff members would try to put her back together correctly at the end of each day, but the repeated cycle of destruction and reconstruction took its toll. Eventually, Mangle lived up to her name, becoming a permanent mess of tangled endoskeleton parts, exposed wiring, and disjointed costume pieces that barely held together. Her appearance became genuinely disturbing, a creature that seemed to defy conventional anatomy, with multiple heads visible among her tangled mass and limbs extending in unnatural directions. Despite this mangled state, or perhaps because of it, she remained active, crawling along the ceiling of the pizzeria during her nighttime movements, her jumbled mass of parts somehow still coordinated enough to hunt. Phone Guy mentions that staff eventually gave up on trying to rebuild her properly, instead treating her as more of a take-apart and put back together attraction, accepting her perpetual mangled state as part of her character. This acceptance of dysfunction, this willingness to let a broken animatronic continue operating, proved to be a mistake with dire consequences. Balloon Boy, often referred to simply as BB, stood out from the other toy animatronics in several ways. First, and most obviously, He was significantly smaller than the others, roughly child-sized rather than the adult height of the main band members. His design didn't draw from any previous Fazbear Entertainment character. He was an entirely new creation for this location, perhaps meant to appeal to the youngest guests by being closer to their own size and proportions. His appearance was distinctly clownish, with a striped shirt, a propeller cap, and a permanent smile that seemed frozen in endless cheer. He carried a balloon in one hand and a sign reading "Balloons" in the other, his role seemingly focused on being a more interactive character than a performer. Perhaps wandering the dining areas during parties to hand out balloons to children or pose for photos. His voice box had been programmed with a limited set of phrases, giggling sounds and repeated words like "hello" and "hi" that grew increasingly unnerving when encountered in the dark hallways during night shifts. Where other animatronics posed a direct physical threat, attempting to attack Jeremy when they reached the security office, Balloon Boy's danger manifested differently. If he made it into the office, which he could do by crawling through the left vent, he wouldn't attack directly. Instead, he'd disable Jeremy's equipment, somehow interfering with both the flashlight and the vent lights. The exact mechanism of how he accomplished this interference was never fully explained. Perhaps some electromagnetic effect from his systems, or a deliberate programming feature meant for a completely different purpose during operating hours. Regardless of the how, the effect was devastating for night guard survival. Without the flashlight, Jeremy couldn't check the hallway for Foxy. Without the vent lights, he couldn't see which animatronics were approaching through the vent system. Balloon Boy's intrusion essentially left the night guard helpless against other threats, turning him from a direct enemy into a force multiplier for the other animatronics' hunting patterns. His childlike appearance and giggling sounds made his threat feel particularly wrong, a corruption of innocence that exemplified how something designed for children's entertainment had become a source of terror. These toy animatronics, for all their advanced technology and improved designs, suffered from a fundamental flaw that Fazbear Entertainment either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Phone Guy mentions that they seemed to have some issues with their programming, particularly regarding the facial recognition system that was supposed to protect employees. He suggests that the animatronics might be seeing adults as endoskeletons without their costumes, triggering a response where they try to stuff the perceived endoskeleton into an animatronic suit. But this explanation doesn't quite account for the deliberate, almost malicious way they hunt at night. Some fans have theorized that the toy animatronics' aggressive behavior stems from possession, that the spirits of children killed during this location's operation somehow influenced their programming, turning security measures into tools for vengeance. Others argue that the incorporation of parts from the withered animatronics during the retrofit process may have inadvertently transferred some of the supernatural influence that haunted the old characters, mixing remnant and agony into the new machines. Whatever the true cause, the result was the same. The bright, friendly faces that entertained children during the day became predators at night, driven by programming errors or spiritual possession, or some combination of both to hunt the one person trying to keep watch over the empty pizzeria. The toy animatronics represented Fazbear Entertainment's future, their attempt to modernize and move past old problems. But you can't escape history by simply building new machines. Not when the same tragedy and violence that defined the past continues to unfold in the present. Not when the man responsible for all that death is still out there, still hunting, still leaving bodies in shadowed corners for security puppets to discover. The withered animatronics, souls that won't rest. Relegated to the parts and service room in the back of the new pizzeria, the withered animatronics sat in various states of disrepair, no longer the stars of the show, but not quite ready to be completely discarded. These were the original performers from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the beloved characters that had entertained children for years before ending up in this sorry state. Their decrepit condition wasn't simply the result of normal wear and tear, though they certainly showed signs of age and heavy use. Something more violent had been done to them. Parts had been removed, presumably to help build or maintain the newer toy animatronics that now occupied the show stage. Endoskeleton components were exposed where costume pieces had been stripped away. Wires dangled from gaps in their casing. Some had lost entire limbs or facial features. They looked like corpses, mechanical bodies that had been gutted and left to decay in a storage room that smelled of must and neglect. Yet despite their broken states, despite being disconnected from main power and supposedly inactive, the withered animatronics moved at night. They left their designated room and wandered the pizzeria's halls alongside the toy versions, their movements jerky and unnatural but undeniably purposeful. Hunting the night guard with the same aggressive intent as their newer counterparts, perhaps even more so, given the hatred that seemed to fuel their actions. Withered Freddy maintained his position as the recognizable face of the franchise even in his deteriorated state. His brown fur was matted and torn in places, revealing the mechanical frame beneath. The top, hat and bow tie that had been his signature accessories remained, though they looked shabby and faded compared to their former glory. His eyes, which should have been the friendly brown or blue of a teddy bear, glowed with an unsettling intensity in the darkness, sometimes appearing as white pinpricks in empty sockets when the lights hit him from certain angles. Where toy Freddy had 2 buttons on his chest as part of his updated design, withered Freddy also sported 2 buttons, a detail that connected him visually to various sprites and minigames shown throughout the series. His lower jaw hung slightly loose, revealing rows of teeth that seemed too numerous and too sharp for what should have been a family-friendly character. During the day, withered Freddy sat motionless in parts and service, surrounded by other broken animatronics and spare components. But Phone Guy notes with confusion that the old animatronics, despite being powered down, somehow reactivate at night. Withered Freddy's pathway through the building during night shifts took him from parts and service into the main hallway, where he'd sometimes appear on camera, staring directly at the lens with those glowing eyes. Unlike the toy animatronics, who primarily used the vent system, withered, Freddy approached the security office through the main hallway entrance, relying on the same general route that his counterpart in the first game had favored. The Freddy Fazbear head mask that fooled the toy animatronics worked on withered Freddy as well, convincing him through whatever logic guided his nighttime activities that the night guard was just another animatronic. But there was something particularly unnerving about having to stare at this broken version of the franchise mascot while wearing that mask, watching those eyes scan the office while praying the disguise would hold long enough for him to leave. Withered Bonnie perhaps exemplified the damage that had been inflicted on these old animatronics more than any other character. His face was completely gone, torn away to reveal the bare endoskeleton skull beneath. Red pinpoint lights glowed where his eyes should have been, staring out from the empty sockets with an intensity that made his faceless state even more disturbing. His left arm had been entirely removed, leaving just a tangle of wires and metal in its place. The signature purple or blue coloring of his costume was faded and torn, hanging off his frame in ways that exposed the mechanical workings underneath. Without a face, without that crucial element of character that helped children relate to animatronics as friendly figures, Withered Bonnie became something purely nightmarish. A stripped machine that moved with clear, hostile intent. His damage wasn't random. Phone Guy mentions that the old animatronics had been used for parts to help maintain the newer models, suggesting that Withered Bonnie's missing components had been deliberately removed and repurposed. Whether his face was removed for the toy Bonnie's construction or for some other purpose, the result was the same. An animatronic rendered unfit for public performance, but still somehow active at night. Withered Bonnie's behavior during the night shift was among the most aggressive of all the animatronics. He didn't follow a predictable pattern or take his time moving through the building. Instead, he could arrive at the security office quickly. His pathway from parts and service through the main hallway to the office entrance, allowing for rapid approaches that gave Jeremy very little warning. The camera system would show him in one room, then suddenly he'd be in the hallway, right outside the office. The mask worked on him just as it did the others, but his faceless appearance made those moments when Jeremy had to sit still while withered. Bonnie stared at him from across the room, particularly tense. There was no friendly face to reassure you that this was just a malfunctioning children's character. There was only the bare endoskeleton skull, the red eyes, and the knowledge that without the mask, this damaged machine would attack without hesitation. Withered Chica showcased a different pattern of decay. Her damage focused in different areas than Bonnie's, but equally disturbing. Her costume showed significant wear, with tears and holes revealing endoskeleton and wiring underneath. Her hands were completely stripped of their covering, leaving only the bare mechanical claws that animatronics used to grip objects. Most unsettlingly, her jaw seemed to hang permanently open, stretched wider than it should naturally go, revealing rows of teeth inside that mouth cavity, and even showing some endoskeleton structure of the head mechanism. This gave her a perpetually hungry appearance, like a creature that existed only to consume. Her orange feet, unlike the rest of her deteriorated body, remained relatively intact, creating an odd visual contrast between functional costume pieces and exposed mechanical parts. The cupcake that original Chica carried as her signature prop was nowhere to be seen with the withered version, perhaps lost during whatever incident led to their removal from service, or simply left behind when they were relocated to storage. Withered Chica's pathway during night shifts typically brought her through parts and service into the main hallway. Similar to Withered Freddy and Withered Bonnie, though she could also occasionally appear in different rooms throughout the building. Her approach was methodical rather than rushed, allowing Jeremy time to track her on cameras as long as he remained vigilant. Phone Guy notes that the old animatronics aren't just wandering randomly at night. They're actively seeking out the security office, drawn toward any sign of human presence after hours. This suggested intelligence, or at least programming sophistication beyond what should have been possible for animatronics that were supposedly powered down. Withered Chica exemplified this disturbing intelligence, her movements indicating she knew where she wanted to go and what she wanted to do when she got there. Constrained only by the building's layout and the night guard's ability to track and prepare for her arrival, Withered Foxy maintained his role as the pirate character even in his damaged state. though his appearance had degraded significantly from whatever glory days he'd enjoyed at the previous location. His suit was heavily tattered, with tears and holes exposing large sections of his endoskeleton. One of his eyes was missing entirely, leaving an empty socket that somehow made his remaining eye seem more focused and intense. His jaw hung at an odd angle, either damaged or simply worn out from years of operation. Unlike the other withered animatronics who were missing costume pieces, withered Foxy's damage seemed more about deterioration than deliberate part removal. As if he'd been in rough shape even before they started cannibalizing the old animatronics for components. He still had his hook hand, that distinctive pirate accessory that helped make Foxy recognizable, though the costume covering his other hand was torn away to show the endoskeleton claws beneath. Where the original Foxy had been slightly tattered even in his prime, designed with that worn pirate aesthetic, withered Foxy took that design philosophy to an extreme, looking like a pirate who'd been dead for years and was somehow still moving. His behavior at night differed from the other withered animatronics in an important way. Whereas the others would approach the security office through the main hallway and could be fooled by wearing the Freddy Fazbear head mask, withered Foxy operated on a different system. He started in parts and service, but wouldn't follow the same path as his fellow old animatronics. Instead, he seemed to remain hidden in the parts and service blind spot on the camera system, that area where the camera coverage didn't quite extend. If Jeremy didn't check on parts and service frequently enough with the camera system, if he didn't flash the flashlight at withered Foxy specifically to drive him back, the pirate would make his way directly to the office through some pathway that bypassed the main hallway. Once he reached the office, the Freddy mask didn't work on him. Jeremy needed to rely entirely on checking the hallway with the flashlight, catching withered Foxy's approach and shining light directly at him repeatedly to make him retreat. This made withered Foxy one of the most dangerous animatronics, as he couldn't be fooled by the same trick that worked on all the others, requiring constant vigilance and draining the flashlight's limited battery through necessary defensive measures. And then there was withered Golden Freddy, the mysterious fifth member of the original animatronic cast, more spirit than machine. Unlike the other withered animatronics who could be tracked moving through the building, who followed pathways from room to room until they reached the security office, withered Golden Freddy simply appeared. One moment, the office would be empty except for Jeremy and whatever animatronics he was actively defending against. And the next moment, withered Golden Freddy would be sitting on the floor, slumped in a heap, like someone had dropped him there. His golden or yellowed appearance distinguished him from withered Freddy's brown coloring, though the exact shade seemed to shift depending on lighting conditions. Like his withered counterpart from the first game, this version of Golden Freddy appeared to be in even worse condition than the other old animatronics, missing parts, slumped over, as if unable to properly support his own weight. Whether this damaged state was his actual physical condition, or simply how he manifested when appearing to the night guard, remained unclear. His behavior defied the rules that seemed to govern the other animatronics. He didn't move through the building on camera. He didn't approach through vents or hallways. He just appeared in the office, suddenly present in a way that suggested he wasn't quite bound by the same physical limitations as the others. If Jeremy didn't react quickly enough, didn't put on the Freddy mask the moment Golden Freddy manifested in the office, the result was an immediate game over, a jump scare that ended the night regardless of how well things had been going up until that point. The fact that the mask worked on Golden Freddy at all was interesting, suggesting that whatever supernatural force powered his manifestation still followed certain rules, still responded to the same tricks that fooled the possessed animatronics. But his ability to simply appear, bypassing all the security measures and monitoring systems that gave Jeremy warning about other threats, made Golden Freddy uniquely terrifying. These withered animatronics, broken and discarded, carried the weight of past tragedies in their deteriorated frames. Their aggressive behavior at night couldn't be explained away by simple programming errors or malfunctions. Something drove them, something that predated their current sorry state, something tied to the original missing children incident that occurred years earlier at the previous Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location. According to the lore gradually revealed through minigames and phone calls across multiple games, 5 children were murdered at that earlier location, their bodies hidden inside the animatronic suits in a horrific crime that went unsolved for years. The spirits of those murdered children possessed the animatronics, their souls bound to the mechanical shells that became their graves. Those possessed animatronics from the original location were now the withered versions sitting in parts and service. Their external condition degraded, but their internal supernatural influence as strong as ever. They remembered. They carried that trauma and rage with them even after being moved to a new location, even after being stripped for parts and left to rot in a storage room. Their nighttime aggression toward Jeremy wasn't random malfunction or programmed response. It was the continued manifestation of spirits seeking something they couldn't quite achieve, whether that was vengeance against their killer, protection of other children they feared might suffer the same fate, or simply a confused lashing out at any adult presence that reminded them of the purple-suited man who'd ended their lives. The withered animatronics weren't just broken machines. They were monuments to violence, physical manifestations of suffering that Fazbear Entertainment couldn't escape simply by building newer, shinier robots to take their place. The puppet, guardian turned haunting. Among all the animatronics at the 1987 Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, one stood apart from both the shiny toy versions and the deteriorated, withered originals. The puppet, also known as the marionette, occupied its own unique space both physically in the prize corner and metaphorically in the lore of the franchise. This slender, elongated figure with its white mask, like face and black body, decorated with white stripes on the wrists and ankles, wasn't designed as a performer like the others. It didn't stand on stage, entertaining children with songs and dances. Its purpose was different, more subtle, manifesting only to dispense prizes to children who'd earned enough tickets from arcade games or to watch over the prize corner area during operating hours. The puppet's design evoked the unsettling aesthetic of Pierrots and vintage toys, something that straddled the line between charming and creepy even before any supernatural elements entered the equation. Its face featured rosy red cheeks, a permanent smile painted in exaggerated lipstick red, and purple tear tracks running down from its eyes, those tears being perhaps the most significant detail for anyone seeking to understand the puppet's true nature. During operating hours, the puppet remained contained in a large gift box in the prize corner, a music box that played a gentle tune to keep it docile. This music box mechanic translated directly into gameplay, forcing Jeremy to wind it regularly through the camera system to prevent the puppet from emerging. Unlike other animatronics who could be fooled by the Freddy mask or repelled by the flashlight, the puppet operated on its own rules. If the music box ran down completely, If Jeremy allowed that melody to fade into silence, the puppet would leave its box and make its way directly to the security office, where no defensive measures would save him. The true significance of the puppet emerged gradually through careful analysis of minigames and environmental storytelling scattered across multiple Five Nights at Freddy's titles. The puppet wasn't just another animatronic. It was the first, the original possessed machine that predated even the missing children incident that created the withered animatronic's hauntings. Years before the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, probably during the early 1980s at either Fredbear's Family Diner or an early Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, a young girl named Charlotte Emily became William Afton's first known victim. The exact circumstances varied slightly between different tellings and different continuities, but the core tragedy remained consistent. Charlotte was locked outside the pizzeria, separated from safety and supervision through either cruel bullying or simple accident. William Afton, already harboring the darkness that would eventually lead to multiple murders, saw an opportunity in the vulnerable child standing alone outside the building. He killed her there, behind the restaurant, leaving her body in the rain. At that same location, there existed a security puppet, an animatronic designed by Charlotte's father, Henry Emily, to watch over children, specifically to protect his daughter by tracking her movements through a bracelet she wore. When Charlotte was locked out, when she needed that protection most, the puppet was trapped inside its gift box, unable to respond to her distress. By the time it managed to break free and navigate out into the rain, it was too late. Charlotte was already gone. The puppet found her body lying in the alley, the rain having soaked through its mechanical systems, causing it to malfunction and collapse beside her. In that moment of machine failure, as the puppet systems shut down next to Charlotte's cooling corpse, something unprecedented happened. Her spirit, whether through sheer determination or supernatural mechanics that no one fully understood, transferred into the animatronic. Charlotte's essence, her consciousness and memories and will, bound itself to the puppet, possessing it in a way that would establish a pattern for future hauntings. Charlotte, as the puppet, became something more than a simple haunting, more than a confused spirit acting on instinct and rage. She retained awareness that other possessed animatronics seemed to lack. She understood, at least to some degree, what had happened to her and what she now was. Where the spirits of the 5 missing children operated on more base instincts, lashing out at any adult presence with animal aggression, Charlotte, as the puppet, demonstrated purpose and planning. She became a guardian figure, watching over the pizzeria not to hunt, but to protect, particularly focused on children who might suffer fates similar to her own. This protective instinct manifested most clearly in one of the game's crucial minigames, Give Gifts, Give Life, a simple, blocky presentation that carried profound implications for the franchise's lore. In this minigame, the puppet moves through a pizzeria, approaching 4 child spirits represented by simple grey figures. To each child, the puppet gives a gift, symbolized by different animatronic heads. Then it gives them life, helping their spirits inhabit the animatronic suits. This minigame depicts the moment when the 5 missing children's souls, the victims of William Afton's massacre at the previous location, were guided into possessing Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. Charlotte, as the puppet, orchestrated this possession, perhaps recognizing that these children's spirits were lost and confused, helping them find vessels that could anchor their existence and give them a form of continued existence, however twisted. A fifth spirit appears briefly at the end of the minigame, representing Golden Freddy's possession, though the exact details of how that haunting occurred remain somewhat ambiguous. The puppet's role in creating these other hauntings established it as a central figure in the franchise's supernatural ecosystem, the one who set the pattern that would define all subsequent possessions. Charlotte's motivation for helping the other children possess animatronics wasn't entirely clear from the games alone. Some interpretations suggested she was genuinely trying to help, giving lost souls a way to remain present in the world, to have some form of existence beyond death. Others argued that she was creating instruments of revenge, ensuring that William Afton's victims would haunt the pizzerias he and Henry Emily had built, making it impossible for the killer to simply move on from his crimes. Henry Emily's speech in the good ending of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator suggested elements of both. He acknowledged that Charlotte was the first soul to become trapped in one of his creations, described it as a wound that he knew he'd have to close eventually, and seemed to recognize that her actions in helping other children possess animatronics came from a desire to protect them, to give them some agency in death that they'd been denied in life. Charlotte, as the puppet, existed in a liminal space between victim and actor, between the haunted and the haunter. Driven by love and loss and a child's understanding of justice that couldn't comprehend the consequences of creating multiple possessed animatronics filled with rage and confusion, her presence at the 1987 location wasn't accidental. She'd followed the franchise, remaining connected to Fazbear Entertainment through multiple location changes, perhaps unable to move on, while William Afton remained unpunished, perhaps simply bound to the puppet's physical form wherever it was moved. During Jeremy's night shifts, the puppet manifested as both protection mechanic and threat. The music box requirement forced him to regularly wind it through the camera system, interrupting his monitoring of other animatronics to ensure the puppet remained contained. This created tension between competing needs, having to choose between tracking approaching threats and maintaining the one absolute defense against the puppet's emergence. Phone Guy never fully explained the music box mechanic in lore terms, treating it as simply another quirk of the animatronics that Jeremy needed to manage. But within the narrative, it suggested that certain sounds or patterns could calm or control the possessed machines, that Charlotte's spirit responded to the melody that had once played when she was alive and safe. If the music stopped, if that calming influence faded, the puppet would emerge from its box in a slow, inevitable progression toward the security office. The cameras would show it leaving the prize corner, moving through hallways with a floating quality that suggested it wasn't quite bound by normal physical movement. It would pass party rooms and corridors, drawing ever closer, while Jeremy frantically tried to wind the music box back up, knowing that once the puppet was fully out, once it had committed to approaching the office, no amount of winding would send it back. Unlike other animatronics whose approaches could be delayed or reset, the puppet operated on a point of no return system. Once it started moving, it would reach its destination regardless of what Jeremy did. The Freddy mask didn't fool it. The flashlight didn't repel it. Nothing stopped it. The only defense was prevention, keeping that music box wound so the puppet never had reason to leave its home in the first place. Yet Charlotte, as the puppet, wasn't truly hunting Jeremy, at least not in the same way the other animatronics did. Her actions during Five Nights at Freddy's 2 aligned more with protection and vigilance than pure aggression. The Save Them minigame, one of the random death screens that could occur, showed the puppet leading withered Freddy through the pizzeria, seemingly trying to guide the animatronic toward the bodies of newly murdered children, attempting to help these fresh victims the same way it had helped the original 5. The puppet's approach to the security office when the music box ran down might not have been intended as an attack at all, at least not from Charlotte's perspective. Perhaps she was checking on the person in the office, ensuring they weren't another threat, or trying to deliver some message that couldn't be communicated through the constraints of her mechanical form. The jump scare that resulted from the puppet reaching Jeremy could be interpreted as Charlotte recognizing a living adult presence and reacting with the trauma and fear that defined her death, unable to differentiate between the security guard trying to survive the night and the man who'd killed her all those years ago. Or perhaps, by the time she possessed Jeremy's body or space, she was simply trying to give him the same gift she'd given the other children, trying to help him find life after death, the only way she knew how, not understanding that he was alive and wanted to stay that way. The puppet's actions throughout the game suggested intelligence and purpose beyond what other animatronics displayed, but that intelligence was filtered through a child's understanding, through trauma and supernatural distortion, making her motives and intentions ultimately inscrutable. To the night guard sitting alone in that office, watching that music box timer count down towards 0, the puppet's presence in Five Nights at Freddy's 2 served as a connection point between past and present tragedies, between the original murders that started everything and the new crimes being committed during this week in November 1987. Charlotte had been William Afton's first victim, the moment when he crossed the line from disturbed individual to child killer. Her death and subsequent possession of the puppet established the pattern of spirits being bound to animatronics, creating the first instance of a phenomenon that would define the entire franchise. Her actions in helping the 5 missing children possess the original animatronics ensured that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza couldn't simply move on from that crime, that those deaths would haunt the company literally and figuratively for years to come. And now, years later, relocated to a new pizzeria with new animatronics but still carrying all that history, Charlotte, as the puppet, watched over another location where William Afton was preparing to kill again. The purple tear tracks on the puppet's face, those distinctive marks that made it recognizable across multiple appearances in different games, took on deeper meaning when you understood they represented Charlotte's endless mourning, the perpetual grief of a child who died alone and scared and never found peace, who tried to help others but could only give them the same half-existence she endured, forever trapped inside a mechanical shell, forever watching, forever trying to protect those she could no longer truly save. Jeremy Fitzgerald, the guard who survived 1 week too many. At the center of Five Nights at Freddy's 2's narrative stood Jeremy Fitzgerald, a young man who accepted what seemed like a straightforward summer job and ended up experiencing 6 of the most terrifying nights of his life before meeting a fate that would become infamous in the franchise's history. We never see Jeremy's face during gameplay, the first-person perspective and survival horror mechanics keeping him as an unseen presence. A pair of hands holding a flashlight and a tablet showing camera feeds. Heavy breathing when wearing the Freddy mask, but no visual identity to attach to the experience. This anonymity was intentional, allowing players to project themselves into Jeremy's position, to feel the fear and tension of each night, as if they were personally sitting in that security office. Yet despite never appearing on screen, Jeremy existed as a fully realized character within the game's lore. his experience documented through paychecks, newspaper clippings, and the calls from Phone Guy that provided context for his week at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Jeremy's employment at the pizzeria appears to have begun around November 7th, 1987, based on working backward from the dates shown on his paychecks. He wasn't the first night guard at this new location. Phone Guy mentions in his first call that the previous guard complained about the animatronics trying to get into the office and was moved to the day shift, leaving a vacancy that Jeremy filled. This detail suggested the animatronics' aggressive nighttime behavior wasn't new, that problems had manifested from the location's opening. Problems serious enough that the previous guard refused to continue working nights. Yet Jeremy accepted the position anyway, either unaware of the specific dangers or perhaps desperate enough for employment that he was willing to overlook warning signs. Phone Guy describes the job as Jeremy's new summer job during the first night's call, though the November timing of the paychecks contradicted this summer framing, creating minor confusion about whether the location had been open longer than the game showed or if there was some calendar discrepancy in Phone Guy's recording. Regardless, Jeremy arrived expecting a standard security position, probably imagining quiet nights watching cameras and dealing with the occasional break-in attempt, completely unprepared for the reality of being hunted by possessed animatronics determined to get into the security office by any means necessary. Night 1 introduced Jeremy to the basic mechanics and dangers of the position, though Phone Guy's call downplayed the severity of what was happening. The greeting was cheerful, welcoming Jeremy aboard and assuring him that he'd do fine, that there was nothing to worry about. Phone Guy explained the animatronics' free roaming mode, their facial recognition technology, the fact that they were allowed to walk around even during the day, all presented as features rather than problems. He mentioned that the old animatronics from the previous location were being kept in storage, that they'd tried retrofitting them with newer technology, but the results weren't great. Everything in that first call was framed as manageable quirks of an unusual workplace, not signs of an actively dangerous situation. Yet that first night, Jeremy would have encountered animatronics moving toward his office, would have seen them on cameras approaching with clear intent, would have needed to use the Freddy mask to survive. The disconnect between Phone Guy's reassuring words and the actual experience of being hunted must have been jarring, creating doubt about whether Jeremy could trust the information being provided, or if he needed to rely entirely on his own observations and instincts. Nights 2 through 5 saw an escalation in both the animatronic's aggression and Jeremy's understanding of his situation. Phone Guy's calls provided additional information each night, explaining the music box requirement for the puppet, noting that the old animatronics seemed to be moving at night despite being powered down, mentioning that Jeremy should try out the Freddy mask in case any animatronics made it into the office. Each call added pieces of crucial survival information while maintaining an overall tone that suggested everything was under control, that these were just quirks to manage rather than signs of something fundamentally wrong with the location. But Jeremy's experience each night would have contradicted that tone. The animatronics didn't move randomly or aimlessly. They actively hunted him, coordinating their approaches through different pathways, forcing him to juggle multiple threats simultaneously. The withered animatronics emerged from parts and service despite being decommissioned. The toy animatronics used the vent system to bypass hallway defenses. The puppet required constant attention to its music box. Balloon Boy could disable his equipment if he got into the office. And Golden Freddy could simply appear without warning manifesting in the office like a ghost. Jeremy survived these nights through some combination of skill, luck, and determination, managing the competing demands of winding the music box, checking cameras, flashing lights, and donning the mask at precisely the right moments. His paycheck for nights 1 through 5 showed his compensation for this week of terror: $100.50 before taxes, approximately $12 per 6-hour night of survival horror, a wage that seemed criminally inadequate for the trauma endured. Night 6 brought a significant change in both Phone Guy's tone and Jeremy's circumstances. The call started with confusion. Phone Guy seemingly surprised that Jeremy was still there, that he'd come back for a 6th night. The cheerful facade from earlier calls dropped away, replaced with genuine concern and hints about the severity of what had been happening at the location. Phone Guy mentioned that someone had used one of the suits, specifically a yellow one from the back, though he didn't explain who had used it or why. He noted that none of the animatronics were acting right anymore, that their behavior had somehow gotten worse. Then came the critical information. There was one more event scheduled, a birthday party the following day, and Jeremy was being moved to the day shift to help cover it. Phone Guy advised him to wear his uniform, to stay close to the animatronics, to ensure they didn't hurt anyone, framing this as a final responsibility before the location dealt with its problems. That 6th-night paycheck showed November 13th, 1987, confirming that Jeremy had completed his week of night shifts. But the newspaper that accompanied that paycheck revealed the location was closing, that the toy animatronics were being scrapped due to possible malfunctions, while the old animatronics were being kept in hopes of a future reopening. This should have been the end of Jeremy's employment. A difficult week survived with a story to tell, and a resolve to never work security at a pizzeria again. But Jeremy Fitzgerald's story most likely didn't end with that 6th-night paycheck. The events that followed his week of night shifts, the day shift he worked on November 14th, would become one of the most discussed and debated moments in Five Nights at Freddy's lore. The Bite of 87, mentioned in the first game as a defining incident that led to animatronics no longer being allowed to walk around during the day, almost certainly occurred during that birthday party Jeremy was assigned to monitor. The evidence strongly suggests Jeremy as the victim. Phone Guy had specifically noted that the animatronics were acting aggressive towards staff, but interactive and friendly with children, creating a situation where Jeremy was told to stay close to the animatronics to protect the children, putting himself in danger from machines that had spent the previous week trying to kill him. The timing aligns perfectly. November 14th being the day after his last night shift paycheck, the day of that final birthday party mentioned in the Night 6 call. The location closed immediately afterward, according to the newspaper, suggesting something catastrophic had happened during that party, something that couldn't be covered up or explained away. While the game never explicitly confirms Jeremy as the victim, all available evidence points toward him being the person who suffered the infamous bite that removed their frontal lobe. The identity of which specific animatronic was responsible for the bite remained a subject of intense fan speculation and theorizing, with no definitive canonical answer ever provided. Mangle emerged as the most popular suspect among the fan base for several compelling reasons. Her jump scare animation in the game showed her lunging downward toward the player's head from the ceiling, consistent with the type of attack that might remove a frontal lobe. Her mangled state, with exposed endoskeleton teeth and a jaw that hung unnaturally, gave her both the means and the appearance of something capable of inflicting such damage. She was active during the day according to her role in the Kids' Cove, making her presence at a birthday party completely normal and expected. Phone Guy's comments about the animatronics acting aggressive towards staff but friendly to children fit with a scenario where Mangle, recognizing Jeremy as the adult human from the night shifts, might have attacked him while leaving the children at the party unharmed. Other theories within the community pointed to Toy Chica because of her missing beak during night mode, suggesting she could bite, or to Toy Freddy simply due to his role as the main character, or even to Balloon Boy, despite his small size and lack of proper teeth. The community has never reached complete consensus, and the games themselves never confirm which animatronic was responsible, leaving this as one of the franchise's enduring mysteries. Regardless of which animatronic specifically attacked, if Jeremy Fitzgerald was indeed the victim, his fate illustrated the core tragedy of Five Nights at Freddy's lore. He was an innocent person who took a job, who showed up to work, and did his best to survive impossible circumstances, who followed instructions from his employer even when those instructions put him in danger. And for his efforts, for his week of survival against possessed machines and supernatural threats, for his willingness to work that final day shift despite everything he'd experienced, Jeremy apparently paid with a catastrophic injury that defined not just his life but the entire franchise going forward. The Bite of 87, the incident that made animatronics too dangerous to allow free roaming during operating hours, the event that will be referenced and discussed throughout the series, happened to someone working that day shift. Phone Guy's later comment in the first game that the victim survived, that it's amazing the human body can live without the frontal lobe, suggests whoever suffered the bite lived through losing that crucial part of their brain, but that survival came at a cost that overshadowed any wages earned. If Jeremy was that victim, as the evidence suggests, his story demonstrated that in the world of Five Nights at Freddy's, survival didn't always mean winning, didn't always mean escaping unscathed. Sometimes survival just meant living long enough to become another casualty, another name added to the list of people harmed by Fazbear Entertainment's negligence and William Afton's crimes. Phone Guy's calls, the voice that couldn't save anyone. Throughout Jeremy Fitzgerald's week at the 1987 Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, one constant presence accompanied him each night through pre-recorded messages that played at the start of every shift. The Phone Guy, voiced by series creator Scott Cawthon himself, served as Jeremy's only connection to the company during those long, dark hours alone in the security office. These messages weren't live conversations. Phone Guy had recorded them previously, likely during his own time working at the location, or as part of his responsibilities as someone in Fazbear Entertainment's management structure. Later revelations from the novel The Week Before would identify Phone Guy's real name as Ralph, but during Five Nights at Freddy's 2, he remained simply the voice on the phone, a personality without a face, offering advice and information that ranged from genuinely helpful to maddeningly inadequate, given the severity of the dangers Jeremy faced. The first night's call set the tone for Phone Guy's entire approach to the job. His greeting was warm and welcoming, addressing Jeremy as someone starting a new summer position despite the November timing on the paychecks. He acknowledged that this was his first night and offered reassurance that everything would be fine, that there was nothing to worry about. This immediate attempt to downplay danger would become a defining characteristic of Phone Guy's communications. This gap between the cheerful presentation and the actual life-threatening reality of the work environment. he explained the introductory greeting from the company. That generic corporate welcome that probably came with every new hire packet, before diving into more specific details about the animatronics. He mentioned that Fazbear Entertainment had spent a small fortune on these new toy animatronics, describing their facial recognition technology, their advanced mobility, their connection to a criminal database that supposedly allowed them to detect predators from a mile away. All of this was presented as positive features, innovations that made the location safer for children and employees alike. He noted that the old animatronics from the previous location were being kept in the back room, that the company had tried to retrofit them with some newer technology, but they'd been too ugly and had started to smell, though they might still be functional in some capacity. This first call established Phone Guy as someone caught between genuine desire to help the new night guard succeed and loyalty to the company that required him to present everything in the best possible light, even when that presentation didn't match reality. Night 2's call continued providing information while maintaining that same careful balance. Phone Guy addressed practical concerns about the building being locked down during Jeremy's shift, explaining this was a temporary precaution due to an ongoing police investigation. He advised Jeremy not to worry about anything he might have heard about the location, that any rumors were exaggerated or false, typical corporate damage control aimed at preventing panic or resignation. He mentioned the old animatronics specifically, noting how much he loved those characters, particularly Foxy, though he acknowledged they could be a bit quirky at night. Then came crucial survival information delivered almost as an afterthought. If any animatronics made it into the office, Jeremy should try wearing the spare Freddy Fazbear head that was sitting in the office, suggesting it might trick them into thinking he was just another animatronic, rather than a human to be stuffed into a suit. This advice was delivered casually, as if suggesting a clever trick, rather than acknowledging the deadly threat that necessitated having such a disguise available. Phone Guy also mentioned the puppet, explaining that it was always thinking and that Jeremy needed to keep it in its box by winding the music box through the camera system. Again, this crucial instruction was presented matter-of-factly. No emphasis on how absolutely essential this task was, or what would happen if he failed to keep that music wound. The call ended with more reassurances. Phone Guy confident that Jeremy would do fine, that he'd make it through the night without problems. Commentary that must have felt hollow if Jeremy had already experienced animatronics aggressively approaching his office during night 1. The third night's call revealed more about the old animatronic's unusual behavior, finally acknowledging that something genuinely strange was happening at the location. Phone Guy noted that the old animatronics were acting very unusual, almost aggressive toward staff during the day, though they seemed fine with the children. He speculated they might have some sort of faulty facial recognition programming, or perhaps they just weren't used to having adults around. This was Phone Guy's closest approach to admitting danger, acknowledging that the animatronic's behavior toward Jeremy wasn't normal or acceptable, though he still framed it as a programming quirk rather than something supernatural or intentionally malicious. He mentioned trying to contact the previous guard to ask about his experience, suggesting that whatever Jeremy was dealing with matched or exceeded what the previous night guard had gone through. Then Phone Guy pivoted to practical advice again, explaining that the building used to be an older location before it was renovated, a continuity detail that helped place this pizzeria in the franchise's evolving geography. He noted there were blind spots in the camera system, areas where coverage wasn't complete, and advised checking those spots regularly with other tools available to Jeremy. The combination of acknowledgement that yes, the animatronics are acting aggressive, and immediate pivoting to practical advice created a strange dynamic, where Phone Guy validated Jeremy's experience while still maintaining that everything was manageable if proper procedures were followed. Nightfall's call took a darker turn, with Phone Guy's tone noticeably different from previous nights. He mentioned that the old animatronics were being kept for parts after the company decided to go with the newer models, confirming what had been implied earlier about the withered animatronics being cannibalized for components. He explained that the building was on lockdown, that no one was allowed to enter or leave, especially concerning animatronics, during the investigation. This was presented as a security measure but created an ominous atmosphere. Jeremy locked inside a building with increasingly aggressive machines, while police investigated something serious enough to require such restrictions. Phone Guy tried to maintain optimism, suggesting that with the new animatronics and some careful repositioning, the problems at the previous location might not be repeated here, a hope that would prove tragically unfounded. He ended the call by noting that tomorrow would be a good day for Jeremy, that the company was going to clean everything up and make things right. Promises that felt increasingly hollow given the escalating danger Jeremy experienced each night. The fifth night's call was brief and focused. Phone Guy cutting through most of the pleasantries to deliver information more directly. He explained the spring lock suits, those older animatronic models that could function as both automated performers and wearable costumes for human employees. The explanation was technical, describing how cranking the devices would compress the animatronic components to create room for a human wearer, but warning that the locks were unstable and could be triggered by moisture or sudden movements, causing the compressed parts to snap back with deadly force. This information about spring lock suits was presented as historical context, Phone Guy explaining something from the past rather than warning about a current threat, but it established the existence of a type of animatronic that would become crucial to understanding later events. He mentioned that these spring lock suits had been retired due to multiple and simultaneous spring lock failures at a sister location, confirming that Fazbear Entertainment knew these devices were dangerous and had officially discontinued their use. The call ended with more reassurances that Jeremy was doing great, that he was really making a difference, the kind of encouragement that felt increasingly disconnected from the reality of spending every night being hunted by possessed machines, while barely compensated for the risk. The 6 nights call marked Phone Guy's most honest and direct communication with Jeremy, the facade of cheerfulness finally cracking under the weight of events. He opened with surprise, noting that Jeremy was still there, that he'd come back for another night despite everything. His tone conveyed genuine concern for Jeremy's well-being, perhaps even some guilt about the situation he'd been placed in. Then came the revelations that changed everything. Someone had used one of the suits, specifically a yellow one that had been stored in the back, and since that happened, none of the animatronics were acting right anymore. The implications were clear without being explicitly stated. Someone had worn a yellow spring lock suit, probably Spring Bonnie given the lore from other games, and something terrible had occurred. Phone Guy didn't identify who used the suit or exactly what they did, but the effect on the animatronic's behavior was dramatic, suggesting that whatever happened had triggered or amplified the supernatural influences that plagued the location. He advised Jeremy that he was being moved to the day shift tomorrow for a birthday party, the last event scheduled before dealing with the location's problems. His tone when delivering this assignment was apologetic, aware that he was asking Jeremy to put himself in danger one more time, to work a day shift supervising animatronics that had spent all week trying to kill him at night. The call ended with what would be Phone Guy's final words to Jeremy, encouraging him to stay close to the animatronics to ensure they didn't hurt anyone, advice that would lead directly to the bite of 87. Looking back at Phone Guy's calls across the entire week, they painted a picture of someone trapped between competing responsibilities. He genuinely seemed to care about Jeremy's survival, offering practical advice that proved helpful for making it through each night. The information about wearing the Freddy mask, winding the music box, checking blind spots with the flashlight, all of these tips were crucial for survival, and Phone Guy delivered them clearly. Yet he was also clearly constrained by his position within Fazbear Entertainment, unable or unwilling to simply tell Jeremy to quit, to get out while he still could. He downplayed dangers, framed terrifying experiences as manageable quirks, maintained that professional optimistic tone even as conditions deteriorated. This wasn't malicious. Phone Guy wasn't trying to get Jeremy hurt. Rather, he seemed to be someone who'd internalized the company's approach to problems, believing, or at least hoping, that proper procedures and safety measures could overcome the supernatural dangers that actually plagued the location. His final call revealed cracks in that belief. Moments where he acknowledged things were bad and getting worse, but even then, he couldn't quite bring himself to break from the corporate script completely, couldn't warn Jeremy away from that day shift assignment that would define his life and the franchise's lore forever. Phone Guy represented the institutional response to Freddy Fazbear's horrors, the attempt to manage and contain rather than confront and expose, and in that role, he failed to protect the people who most needed protecting, including Jeremy Fitzgerald and eventually himself, during his own final week at the first game's location. What saved them reveals more deaths at the location, while Jeremy Fitzgerald fought to survive each night in the security office, while the toy and withered animatronics hunted him through flickering camera feeds. The Save Them Death minigame that could randomly occur after Jeremy's death revealed something deeply troubling happening within the pizzeria. This minigame, presented through deliberately primitive graphics and limited interactivity that characterized all of Five Nights at Freddy's 2's death minigames, showed bodies scattered throughout the location during what appeared to be the same time period as Jeremy's employment. Though exactly what this represents has been debated extensively within the FNAF community. The Save Them minigame allowed players to control withered Freddy, moving him through a blocky representation of the pizzeria's layout that matched the actual building where Jeremy worked. As withered Freddy moved from room to room, letters would spell out the words "Save Them" repeatedly, a desperate plea or command that drove the minigame's purpose. Throughout the pizzeria, hidden in corners and shadowed areas, were sprites that appeared to represent dead children. 5 bodies left scattered across the location. One body lay in Party Room 1, another in the hallway outside the office, one near Kids Cove where Mangle performed, another in the prize corner near the Puppets box, and the final victim placed near the show stage. The blood visible around these bodies, shown in red pixels despite the minigame's generally black and white color scheme, suggested these deaths were being depicted as recent events connected to the location's current operation. The puppet's presence in the Save Them minigame was significant, its sprite leading withered Freddy through the building toward these bodies. This suggested that Charlotte Emily, possessing the puppet, had detected what was happening, had recognized that new children were dying, and was attempting to guide the possessed animatronics toward them. Her actions mirrored what she'd done after the original missing children incident, trying to help the spirits of murdered children by giving them vessels to inhabit, animatronic shells that could allow some form of continued existence beyond death. But in this minigame, she couldn't complete that process. The screen would occasionally flash with static, particularly when withered Freddy moved to certain locations or when specific events occurred. If players managed to navigate through a complete sequence, reaching particular rooms in the right order, they'd occasionally encounter another sprite that brought everything into terrible focus. A purple figure appeared, moving through the pizzeria during what should have been operating hours. Based on the series' established visual language, where purple figures consistently represent William Afton across multiple games, this sprite almost certainly depicts Afton himself committing these murders. When withered Freddy's sprite made contact with the purple figure's sprite, the screen didn't cut to a normal game over. Instead, it displayed blue static rather than the red static that accompanied other deaths, and text appeared in the corner reading, "You can't." A message that suggested Charlotte, as the puppet, was trying to use the possessed animatronics to stop Afton, but couldn't overcome whatever protected him or gave him power in that moment. The deaths shown in Save Them appeared to connect with Phone Guy's references throughout the week. His mention of the ongoing police investigation, the building being on lockdown, the rumors that Jeremy shouldn't worry about, could all point toward children having gone missing from the pizzeria during this time period. The sixth night's revelation about someone using one of the yellow suits suggested a killer had been active at the location. The newspaper that appeared with Jeremy's final paycheck, announcing the location's immediate closure and the scrapping of the toy animatronics, mentioned the closure was due to possible malfunctions, but never directly stated that children had been harmed or killed. This was typical of Fazbear Entertainment's approach to tragedy, burying uncomfortable truths under vague language and technical explanations. The minigame's depiction of bodies throughout the pizzeria, combined with the purple figure sprite that appears when exploring thoroughly, suggested something terrible had occurred at this location. Though the exact nature and timing of these events relative to the original missing children incident has remained a topic of debate within the community. The big question raised by the Save Them minigame and these new murders was whether the toy animatronics had been possessed by these 5 new victims, a debate that remains unresolved within the community. The aggressive behavior the toy animatronics displayed toward Jeremy during night shifts, behavior that couldn't be fully explained by programming errors or facial recognition malfunctions alone, could potentially be attributed to possession by the spirits of children murdered during that same week. This would create a disturbing parallel to the withered animatronics, who were confirmed to be possessed by the original missing children and hunted adults as a result of their trauma and confusion. If the toy animatronics were possessed by these new victims, their aggression toward Jeremy would make sense, as the misdirected rage of spirits who couldn't distinguish between the security guard and their killer. Charlotte, as the puppet, might have been trying to give these 5 new spirits the same gift she'd given the original victims, helping them possess the toy animatronics to anchor their existence. This possession could explain why the toys were ordered to be scrapped after the location's closure, rather than kept for potential reuse like the withered originals. Fazbear Entertainment might have recognized something wrong with the toy animatronics beyond simple malfunctions, some influence or presence that made them too dangerous to ever put back into service. However, the possession status of the toy animatronics remained far more ambiguous than the withered animatronics' confirmed hauntings. The withered animatronics were definitively possessed by the original 5 missing children, their behaviors and the lore surrounding them establishing that connection clearly through multiple games. But the toy animatronics existed in uncertain territory. They exhibited behaviors that seemed supernatural, with glowing eyes in some instances, and aggressive hunting patterns that appeared driven by more than simple programming. Yet, they could also be explained through malfunctions and the retrofitting process that incorporated parts from the withered animatronics, potentially transferring some supernatural influence without full possession occurring. The fact that they were scrapped rather than disabled suggested Fazbear Entertainment considered them beyond repair, but whether that was due to possession, extreme mechanical failure, or simply public relations concerns after the bite remained unclear. Some interpretations have argued that the 5 children from the Save Them minigame were destined to possess the toy animatronics, but Charlotte's efforts were interrupted, preventing full possession from occurring. Others have suggested the possessions completed, but were somehow less stable or complete than the original hauntings. Still others question whether the bodies shown in Save Them even represent dead children at all, proposing alternative interpretations of what the minigame depicts. The games themselves never provide definitive answers about the toy animatronics' supernatural status, leaving this as one of the franchise's most debated mysteries. What remained clear from the Save Them minigame was that something deeply wrong had occurred at the location, that William Afton's presence was implied through the purple figure sprite, and that Charlotte, as the puppet, was aware and attempting to respond. The yellow suit mentioned in Phone Guy's 6th night call, confirmed in later games to be the Spring Bonnie costume, provided a means for someone to approach children without raising suspicion, to lure them using the familiar image of a Fazbear Entertainment mascot. The police investigation mentioned throughout the week suggested that authorities were aware something was wrong, but they hadn't managed to identify a culprit or prevent the tragedy. The exact relationship between the deaths shown in Save Them and the original missing children incident has been extensively debated. Some interpretations suggest these represent entirely separate victims, a second wave of murders occurring years after the first. Others propose that Save Them might be depicting the same incident shown in other minigames, but from a different perspective or time frame, with the FNAF 2 location potentially being the site of the original murders before being closed and reopened. The No DCI theory, standing for No Dead Children Incident, has even questioned certain assumptions about what the minigame depicts. What can be stated with confidence is that Save Them shows dead children in the FNAF 2 location, shows the puppet trying to reach them, shows a purple figure consistent with William Afton's representation throughout the series, and ends with the message "you can't" when trying to catch the purple figure, emphasizing powerlessness in the face of these tragedies. The Save Them minigame, with its blocky graphics and simple gameplay, conveyed the helplessness that defined some of Five Nights at Freddy's darkest lore implications. Players could see bodies scattered throughout the location. They could watch Charlotte as the puppet trying to lead withered Freddy toward them, attempting to help in whatever way she could. They could even occasionally encounter the purple figure, widely interpreted as William Afton based on the series' visual conventions. But players couldn't save them. They couldn't stop what the minigame depicted. The words "save them" spelled out across the minigame weren't instructions that could be followed successfully. They represented a plea that went unanswered, an acknowledgement that children were in danger and no one, not the puppet, not the possessed animatronics, not even the player, could provide the protection they needed. Whether these victims were separate from the original missing children incident or represented those same tragedies from another angle, the minigame emphasized recurring themes of institutional failure, powerlessness in the face of evil, and the cyclical nature of tragedy at Fazbear Entertainment locations. The Bite of 87, a tragedy foretold. Of all the events in Five Nights at Freddy's lore, few have captured fan attention and sparked as much speculation as the Bite of 87, an incident referenced in the very first game, but never explicitly shown or fully explained. Phone Guy's casual mention in the original game, "It's amazing that the human body can live without the frontal lobe," was delivered as an aside during his first night's call, establishing that something horrific had occurred in 1987, and that this incident fundamentally changed how Fazbear Entertainment operated their animatronics. The reveal that Five Nights at Freddy's 2 took place in November 1987 meant players were experiencing the events leading up to this infamous bite, watching the stage being set for a tragedy that would define the franchise's safety protocols and public perception for years to come. The pieces of what happened fell into place through careful examination of multiple elements. Jeremy Fitzgerald worked nights at the pizzeria from November 7th through November 13th, facing increasingly aggressive animatronics and deteriorating conditions as the week progressed. His Night 6 paycheck confirmed his last night shift ended on November 13th, but the week's story didn't end there. Phone Guy's call on Night 6 delivered crucial information that set up what was coming. He explained that tomorrow, November 14th, there would be one final event scheduled at the location, a birthday party. This party would be the last function before the pizzeria dealt with its mounting problems, the animatronics' aggressive behavior, and the ongoing police investigation, and whatever other issues had accumulated. Phone Guy told Jeremy he was being moved to the day shift for this event, instructed to wear his uniform and stay close to the animatronics to make sure they didn't hurt anyone. On its surface, this seemed like a reasonable assignment, using an experienced employee who'd survived a week of night shifts to provide an extra layer of safety for the final party. But given what Jeremy had experienced, given that the animatronics had spent 6 nights trying to kill him, the assignment was actually sending him directly into danger. Phone Guy's earlier calls had established that the animatronics, particularly the old ones, were acting aggressively towards staff members during the day. He'd specifically noted they were fine with children, seemed to interact normally with young guests, but showed hostility toward adult employees. This created a situation where Jeremy, as an adult staff member, was at risk from animatronics that children playing around him would have no problem with. The toy animatronics were still allowed to walk around during the day, that advanced mobility feature Phone Guy had praised in his first call. They weren't confined to the stage or kept away from guests. They mingled, they interacted, they moved freely through the pizzeria during operating hours. This gave them access and opportunity, the ability to approach Jeremy while he performed his assigned duties of staying close to them during the party. The combination of aggressive behavior towards staff, free roaming mode during the day, and Jeremy's presence at a birthday party created the perfect conditions for disaster. What exactly happened during that party? Which specific animatronic attacked Jeremy, and under what circumstances, remained somewhat ambiguous in the games themselves. No cutscene showed the bite occurring. No minigame depicted the moment. But the evidence pointed strongly toward Jeremy being the victim based on timing, and fan consensus largely settled on Mangle as the most likely culprit, based on several factors. Mangle's jump-scare animation in the game showed her swooping down from above to attack the player's head, specifically targeting the frontal area in a way that matched how one might lose their frontal lobe. Her mangled state, with exposed endoskeleton teeth and an unhinged jaw, gave her both the physical capability and the visual suggestion of something that could inflict severe head trauma. As a toy animatronic, she was allowed to roam during the day, making her presence at a birthday party entirely normal and expected. Her location in Kids Cove, an area designed for close interaction with children where they could play with her, take apart and put back together feature, meant she'd been positioned for direct engagement with guests rather than maintaining distance like stage performers might. And Phone Guy had specifically mentioned that the toy animatronics weren't acting right after someone used that yellow suit, suggesting their behavior had become more erratic and dangerous following William Afton's murders. The bite itself, as described by Phone Guy in the first game, caused the victim to lose their frontal lobe, but survive. This was a specific type of catastrophic head injury, the frontal lobe being the front portion of the brain, responsible for cognitive functions like decision-making, problem-solving, and emotional regulation. Losing this part of the brain would cause permanent and severe neurological damage, fundamentally changing the victim's personality and capabilities, while technically leaving them alive. Phone Guy's amazement that the human body can live without the frontal lobe wasn't casual cruelty. It was genuine surprise at the resilience of human physiology in the face of such trauma. But survival in this case wasn't a happy ending. Jeremy Fitzgerald, if he was indeed the victim as all evidence suggested, lived through the bite only to face a lifetime of disability and altered consciousness. His week of surviving possessed animatronics ended not with death, but with something arguably worse, permanent injury that robbed him of crucial cognitive function while leaving him aware enough to remember what had happened. The aftermath of the bite was immediate and severe. The newspaper that appeared with Jeremy's Night 6 paycheck announced the location's closure, stating that the toy animatronics were being scrapped, while the old animatronics were being kept in hopes of future use. This decision suggested Fazbear Entertainment blamed the bite on the toy animatronics, or at least on mechanical issues that affected the new models more than the old ones. The scrapping of the toys, characters the company had spent a small fortune developing, indicated they viewed these animatronics as too compromised to salvage, whether from mechanical damage, possession, or simply public relations concerns about putting machines back into service after one of them had removed a guest or employee's frontal lobe. The newspaper's language carefully avoided specifying what had happened, mentioning possible malfunctions as the reason for closure. Typical corporate obfuscation designed to minimize legal liability and public relations damage. But anyone reading between the lines would understand that something catastrophic had occurred, something that ended the 1987 location's brief operation and reinforced Fazbear Entertainment's reputation for dangerous conditions. The institutional response to the bite established new protocols that would affect all future Fazbear Entertainment operations. Phone Guy's comment in the first game about animatronics no longer being allowed to walk around during the day, having to stay on stage during operating hours, directly resulted from the bite incident. This policy change acknowledged that free-roaming animatronics posed an unacceptable risk to guests and staff, that the injury potential of these large mechanical performers needed to be constrained through strict movement limitations. The restriction fundamentally changed how Fazbear Entertainment operated their pizzerias going forward. Removing one of the key features that had made the toy animatronics special in favor of traditional stage performances, where animatronics remained in fixed positions during shows. This was presented as a safety improvement, but it also represented an admission that the company couldn't control their own creations, couldn't guarantee that possessed or malfunctioning animatronics wouldn't harm people if given freedom of movement. The bite of 87 became infamous not just for the injury it caused, but for what it represented about Fazbear Entertainment as an institution. The company knew their animatronics were dangerous. Phone Guy's calls throughout the week acknowledged aggressive behavior, programming issues, and unexplained phenomena. Jeremy had experienced 6 nights of being actively hunted by these machines, proving they posed a lethal threat to employees. Yet Fazbear Entertainment continued operating, continued hosting parties and events, continued exposing children and staff to animatronics they knew were malfunctioning. When tragedy finally occurred, when an animatronic attacked during a birthday party and severely injured someone, the company's response was to close that location, scrap the implicated animatronics, and implement new restrictions. But they didn't fundamentally change their business model. They didn't stop using animatronics. They didn't conduct a thorough investigation into why their machines were attacking people. They just adjusted policies enough to provide legal cover and moved forward, opening new locations with the old animatronics that had also demonstrated aggressive tendencies, perpetuating the cycle of danger that defined the franchise. For Jeremy Fitzgerald, assuming he survived the bite as law suggested, his experience represented the ultimate failure of institutional responsibility. He'd been hired for what was presented as a standard security position, exposed to supernatural threats that no reasonable person would expect or prepare for, given minimal guidance and inadequate tools for survival, and then assigned to a day shift role that placed him directly in harm's way after a week of trauma. His survival through 6 nights of horror, his willingness to return each shift despite the dangers, his compliance with Phone Guy's instructions even when they seemed questionable, none of this protected him from becoming the victim of the incident that would define the franchise. The bite didn't happen because Jeremy made a mistake. It happened because Fazbear Entertainment created conditions where tragedy was inevitable, where aggressive animatronics were allowed to interact with staff and guests without adequate safeguards, where profit and reputation were prioritized over human safety. Jeremy's injury was the logical conclusion of those institutional failures, the moment when all the warning signs and near misses finally resulted in the catastrophic outcome that everyone should have seen coming. The minigames, windows into hidden horror, interspersed throughout 5 Nights at Freddy's 2's survival horror gameplay, were moments of unexpected narrative clarity, random death minigames that could occur after Jeremy's death, instead of the normal game over screen. These minigames, rendered in deliberately primitive 8-bit style graphics that recalled the earliest days of arcade gaming, told stories that the main gameplay couldn't convey directly, where the nights in the security office focused on immediate survival, managing animatronics and resources in a tense battle against time and threats. The minigames pulled back to show broader context. They revealed events from different time periods, different perspectives, different locations within the Fazbear Entertainment timeline. Understanding these minigames required careful observation of details, recognition of repeating visual motifs, and willingness to piece together narratives from minimal information. But for players who engaged with them seriously, these brief interactive sequences provided crucial insights into the franchise's lore, answering questions about character motivations and supernatural mechanics that the main games left deliberately obscure. Take Cake to the Children presented perhaps the simplest minigame in terms of mechanics, but one that carried profound implications for the entire franchise's story. Players controlled a blocky representation of Freddy Fazbear in what appeared to be a single room, maybe a party room or dining area at an early Fazbear entertainment location. Children, represented by even simpler sprites, waited impatiently for Freddy to bring them cake. The gameplay loop was straightforward. Move Freddy to each child, deliver cake, keep them happy. But this peaceful scene was interrupted by horror occurring just outside the visible play area. Through a doorway or window at the top of the screen, players could see another child standing alone outside the building, crying. A car pulled up. A figure emerged, identified by the purple coloring that the series uses to represent William Afton throughout multiple games. The purple figure approached the crying child. The child turned grey, a visual indicator of death in the series' symbolic language. And Freddy, inside the building, despite noticing the child outside, couldn't leave, couldn't help, constrained by programming or physical limitations that kept him from exiting the restaurant. The minigame ended with an image of the puppet, and later games would confirm through the security puppet minigame that this scene depicted Charlotte Emily's death, the first murder committed by William Afton, the tragedy that would set all subsequent hauntings and possessions in motion. Letters spelling "Save Him" appeared during the minigame. Though given Charlotte's identity as a girl, this pronoun was likely either an error or perhaps referred to the puppet itself, which is often gendered as male, rather than Charlotte specifically. Give Gifts, Give Life showed the puppet's crucial role in creating the other possessed animatronics, providing visual confirmation for events that had been implied through environmental storytelling and Phone Guy's vague references. The minigame started with 4 simple child sprites, grey figures representing the spirits of dead children, standing in darkness. Players controlled the puppet, that distinctive black and white figure with its painted smile and tear tracks, moving between the children. To each child, the puppet delivered a gift, specifically the heads of animatronic characters. One received Freddy's head, another got Bonnie's, a third received Chica's. The fourth was given Foxy's head. After distributing these gifts, the puppet then appeared to give each child life, helping their spirits transfer into the animatronic suits represented by those heads. The children's sprites transformed, becoming animated, suggesting they'd successfully possessed the physical shells. Finally, a 5th child appeared briefly, just for a moment, before Golden Freddy's head materialized. This sequence depicted Charlotte as the puppet, orchestrating the possession of the 5 missing children from the original incident, guiding their lost souls into the animatronic bodies, where they could continue existing as something other than simply dead. The minigame established the puppet as the catalyst for other hauntings, the entity that transformed child murder victims into possessed animatronics through some supernatural process that the games never fully explain mechanically. Give Gifts, Give Life also raised interesting questions about the nature of possession in Five Nights at Freddy's Law. Charlotte didn't just allow these children to possess animatronics randomly. She actively facilitated it, distributing specific characters to specific spirits. This suggested some agency or intelligence in how possessions occurred, that it wasn't simply automatic souls seeking any nearby vessel, but rather a guided process where the puppet matched spirits to appropriate animatronics. The minigame showed this happening after the children were already dead, their spirits already present as grey figures, which aligned with the timeline where the missing children incident occurred first. Bodies were hidden in the animatronic suits, and then the puppet helped their spirits actually inhabit and animate those suits. The brief appearance of the fifth child before Golden Freddy's manifestation suggested that character's possession was somehow different, more fleeting or less stable than the others, a visual representation of Golden Freddy's unique status throughout the series as more ghost than animatronic, more ethereal presence than physical threat. The simplicity of the minigame's presentation, just basic sprites in darkness with minimal animation, made the horror it depicted somehow more profound. Stripping away the jump scares and atmosphere of the main game to show the cold reality of dead children being helped into mechanical shells by another dead child, trying to give them some form of continued existence. Go, Go, Go minigame showed events that appeared to depict the original missing children incident from a different perspective, filling in details about how those 5 children ended up dead in the first place. Players controlled Foxy the Pirate, moving through a simplified version of a pizzeria. Children, represented by small sprites, gathered to watch Foxy emerge from Pirate Cove, excited to see the character perform. But as Foxy moved through the building, the scene changed. The children disappeared. Purple figure William Afton again stood among them. When Foxy returned to the area where the children had been, they were gone, replaced by grey sprites indicating death. The minigame repeated this sequence multiple times, showing Foxy coming out to see children, then finding them dead after the purple figure appeared, creating a loop of horror where the pirate character witnessed the aftermath of multiple murders but couldn't prevent them. Letters spelling Go, Go, Go appeared throughout, perhaps referencing Foxy's characteristic running behavior, or creating a sense of urgency that the minigame's loop structure ultimately revealed as futile. The implication was clear. William Afton had murdered these children at the original location while they were waiting to see Foxy perform, using the restaurant's layout and normal operations as cover for his crimes. The minigame ended with Foxy's jump scare, suggesting either that Foxy's spirit was traumatized by witnessing these deaths, or that one of the murdered children's spirits had possessed Foxy, creating the aggressive behavior he'd later exhibit toward night guards. Save Them, already discussed in its own section, brought the minigame series into the present timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, showing events concurrent with Jeremy's night shifts, where the other minigames depicted past tragedies that explained why animatronics were possessed. Save Them showed tragedy actively unfolding. William Afton murdering 5 more children during the same week Jeremy worked at the location. The minigame structure, with players controlling Withered Freddy while trying to follow the puppet through the pizzeria, emphasized the helplessness that defined the puppet's attempts to protect children. Charlotte could see what was happening. She could try to guide the possessed animatronics toward the bodies, attempt to help these new victims the same way she'd helped previous ones. But she couldn't prevent the murders. She couldn't stop William Afton even when Withered Freddy's sprite made contact with his purple figure. The "you can't" message that appeared during such encounters wasn't just a gameplay limitation. It was a narrative statement about the puppet's powerlessness despite her awareness and intentions. She could give dead children new forms, could help spirits possess animatronics, but she couldn't save them while they were still alive, couldn't prevent Afton from continuing to kill. The Save Them minigame bridged past and present, showing that the horrors that created the withered animatronics' possessions were being repeated with the toy animatronics, that the cycle of violence that defined Fazbear Entertainment's history hadn't ended just because they opened a new location with advanced technology and safety features. These minigames collectively painted a picture of a franchise trapped in cycles of violence, where the same patterns repeated across different locations and time periods. Charlotte died alone, locked out of safety, becoming the first spirit to possess an animatronic. She then helped 5 other murdered children possess the original animatronic band, extending the haunting that her death had initiated. Those possessed animatronics ended up in storage at the 1987 location, still aggressive, still driven by the trauma of their murders. And during that same period, William Afton killed again, creating 5 more victims whose spirits might possess the toy animatronics, perpetuating the cycle for another generation. The minigames showed that this pattern wasn't accidental or coincidental. The same purple figure appeared across different time periods, confirming that William Afton was responsible for multiple sets of child murders spanning years. The puppet, Charlotte's possessed form, witnessed or participated in the aftermath of each incident, trying to help in the only way she knew how but unable to break the cycle that kept producing new victims. And the locations themselves, whether the original pizzeria where the first murders occurred, or the 1987 location where new murders happened, provided the stage for these tragedies. Their party rooms and hallways becoming crime scenes disguised as entertainment venues. The deliberate primitiveness of these minigames' graphics served a purpose beyond simple nostalgia, for 8-bit aesthetics. By stripping the visuals down to basic shapes and colors, by removing all the detailed modeling and atmospheric lighting that made the main game scary, the minigames forced players to focus on the pure horror of what they depicted. A purple figure approaches a crying child. The child turns grey. That's murder presented in the starkest possible terms. No gore or violence shown explicitly, but the meaning undeniable. 4 grey figures stand in darkness, representing dead children's spirits. The puppet gives them animatronic heads. That's the moment when murder victims become vengeful ghosts, when corpses become possessed machines, shown through simple sprite animations that somehow conveyed the weight of those transformations more effectively than any realistic graphics could have. The minigames were windows into hidden horror, moments when the game stopped focusing on survival and jump scares to show players what had actually happened, to establish that beneath all the animatronic attacks and creepy atmosphere was a story about dead children, about a serial killer, about institutions that enabled violence through negligence and cover-ups. They gave context to Jeremy's terror, explaining why the animatronics hunted him, showing that they weren't simply malfunctioning machines, but vessels containing the traumatized spirits of murdered children. And they confirmed that the danger wasn't just supernatural, that William Afton was still out there, still killing, still wearing that yellow suit to gain children's trust before destroying their lives. The closure, when music stops and lights go dark, the week of November 7th through 14th, 1987, marked the entirety of the new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location's operational life in any meaningful sense. From the moment Jeremy Fitzgerald started his first night shift on the 7th to the final birthday party on the 14th, where the bite of 87 occurred, the pizzeria existed in a state of barely controlled chaos, operating under police investigation with increasingly aggressive animatronics and a serial killer actively murdering children on the premises. This couldn't last. No amount of corporate spin or safety promises could overcome the fundamental reality that the location was a death trap, a place where children were being killed and employees were being maimed. The newspaper that appeared alongside Jeremy's Night 6 paycheck delivered the inevitable verdict. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the grand reopening that was supposed to represent the franchise's successful reinvention, would close its doors, effective immediately after that final birthday party. The newspaper's language was carefully chosen to protect Fazbear Entertainment from legal liability while conveying enough information to explain the closure. It mentioned that the toy animatronics, the expensive new models the company had invested heavily in, were being scrapped due to possible malfunctions. Not confirmed malfunctions. Not demonstrated dangers. Possible malfunctions, vague enough to suggest uncertainty, while acknowledging something was wrong with these characters. The decision to scrap them entirely rather than attempting repairs or keeping them in storage spoke to how severely compromised these animatronics were, whether from mechanical damage, supernatural possession, or simply public relations concerns after one of them had potentially removed someone's frontal lobe during a birthday party. The toy animatronics had represented the future of Fazbear Entertainment, cutting-edge technology and child-friendly designs that were supposed to overcome the franchise's troubled past. Their complete disposal, relegated to scrap metal after just a few weeks of operation, marked a spectacular failure of that vision. Interestingly, the newspaper noted that the old animatronics, the withered versions that had been kept in parts and service throughout the location's brief operation, were being retained. Fazbear Entertainment planned to keep them, the newspaper explained, in hopes of reopening the franchise on a smaller budget sometime in the future. This decision seemed bizarre on its surface. The withered animatronics were in terrible condition, missing parts and heavily damaged. They'd been stripped for components to help build the toys, reducing them to barely functional shells. They smelled bad, according to Phone Guy's earlier comments. They moved at night despite being powered down, exhibiting the same supernatural behavior that made the toys dangerous. By any reasonable assessment, these old machines should have been scrapped alongside the toy versions, disposed of safely rather than kept for potential reuse. But Fazbear Entertainment saw value in them. Whether nostalgic appeal from customers who remembered the original characters, the practical consideration that they already owned these animatronics and wouldn't need to invest in new ones, or perhaps some deeper awareness that these characters were too important to the franchise's identity to abandon completely. The decision to keep the withered animatronics while scrapping the toys suggested the company had learned nothing from the week's events, was simply doubling down on the very machines that were already demonstrated to be dangerous in favor of those that were even more compromised. The closure process itself wasn't shown in the game, but we can infer how it played out based on standard business procedures and what we know from later games. The pizzeria would have been locked down immediately after the bite incident, probably with police and emergency services flooding the building to deal with the injured victim and secure the crime scene. Parents waiting to pick up their children from the party would have faced chaos and confusion, demanding answers about what happened while Fazbear Entertainment scrambled to control the narrative. Employees who'd witnessed the bite or its immediate aftermath would need to be managed, either through non-disclosure agreements or carefully worded official statements that minimize the company's liability. The animatronics themselves would need to be secured and processed. The toys methodically dismantled and sent to scrap facilities while the withered versions were carefully packed for storage and eventual transport to whatever location Fazbear Entertainment used for keeping discontinued characters. The building itself would be cleared out, party decorations removed, prize corner toys boxed up, kitchen equipment either sold or moved to storage. Within days or weeks, the pizzeria that had briefly hummed with music and laughter and the screams of children being murdered would become just another empty retail space, a failed restaurant in a strip mall where something terrible had happened. For Jeremy Fitzgerald, if he was indeed the bite victim, as the evidence suggests, the closure meant the end of his employment, but the beginning of a lifetime dealing with the consequences of that injury. Losing one's frontal lobe doesn't just cause physical disability, it fundamentally alters personality, cognitive function, and quality of life. Jeremy would face challenges in making decisions, regulating emotions, and maintaining the sense of self he'd had before the bite. If he retained memories of that week working night shifts, if he remembered being hunted by possessed animatronics and surviving 6 nights of supernatural horror, only to be attacked during a birthday party, that trauma would layer on top of the neurological damage, creating a burden that no amount of workers' compensation or legal settlements could adequately address. The newspaper's cold mention of possible malfunctions didn't capture what Jeremy had experienced or what he'd lost. It reduced his injury to a bureaucratic line item. One more cost of doing business for Fazbear Entertainment. One more victim added to a list that kept growing longer with each location the company opened. For the murdered children, the closure meant nothing. Their bodies had been discovered according to the Save Them minigame, which presumably led to the police investigation phone guy mentioned. But discovery of bodies didn't mean justice. William Afton, despite being active at the location during the week Jeremy worked there, despite using that yellow suit to lure victims, despite leaving corpses scattered through party rooms and the hallways, somehow evaded arrest or even identification as a suspect. The investigation phone guy referenced apparently didn't lead to any convictions, any answers for grieving families. The children's spirits, whether they successfully possessed the toy animatronics or remained trapped in other ways, found no peace from the location's closure. Charlotte, as the puppet, who tried so desperately to help them, couldn't do anything more once the pizzeria shut down. The cycle of violence that had claimed these 5 new victims continued uninterrupted. William Afton free to potentially kill again at future locations, while the institutional failures that enabled his crimes remained unaddressed. For Fazbear Entertainment, the closure was costly but survivable, a setback rather than an ending. They'd lost their investment in the toy animatronics, abandoned a recently renovated building, suffered damage to their already questionable reputation. The legal liability from the bite and the murders would require settlements and lawyers, expenses that cut into profit margins. But the company continued existing, retained ownership of their intellectual property and remaining animatronics, maintained their plans to reopen eventually on a smaller budget. The newspaper's mention of future reopening suggested this closure was treated as temporary, a regroupable moment, rather than the final conclusion of a company that had repeatedly failed to protect children and employees. This resilience in the face of catastrophic failures spoke to how franchise businesses operated, how corporate structures could insulate decision-makers from consequences, how brands could survive almost any scandal if they had enough resources and determination to push forward. The 1987 location's brief existence and rapid closure established a pattern that would repeat throughout Fazbear Entertainment's history. A location opens with hope and promise. Problems immediately manifest, whether supernatural, mechanical, or human-caused. Management downplays the dangers while continuing operations. Tragedy occurs, usually involving children's deaths or severe injuries. The location closes amid investigations and bad press. Fazbear Entertainment regroups, retains assets, plans another attempt. The cycle repeats at a new location with minimal changes to address the underlying issues that caused the previous failure. This pattern persisted because no force existed to break it. No external authority with the power and will to shut down Fazbear Entertainment permanently. No internal reform that would prioritize safety over profit. The closure of the 1987 location was one more iteration of this cycle, meaningful only in how it affected specific individuals like Jeremy Fitzgerald and the 5 murdered children, functionally meaningless in terms of preventing future tragedies at future locations. The newspaper Image that delivered news of the closure appeared alongside Jeremy's final paycheck, creating a visual juxtaposition that summarized the entire Five Nights at Freddy's 2's experience. On one side, compensation for a week of literal hell, barely enough money to cover basic expenses. On the other side, announcement of consequences that came too late to save anyone. Jeremy had survived the nights only to fall victim during the day. The children had been murdered while the location operated normally. The closure came after the damage was done, after people were hurt and killed, after William Afton had already claimed his victims and moved on. This timing wasn't coincidental or unfortunate. It was inevitable given how Fazbear Entertainment operated, given their priorities and practices. The closure represented not a safety measure, but damage control, shutting down after tragedy rather than preventing it, minimizing losses rather than protecting lives. And in that sense, the newspaper's matter-of-fact tone, its focus on mechanical malfunctions and budget considerations, rather than human cost, captured everything wrong with the institution it described. A company that viewed dead children and maimed employees as unfortunate complications in their entertainment business, rather than catastrophic moral failures that demanded fundamental change. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 in the greater timeline. Understanding Five Nights at Freddy's 2's place in the franchise's chronological timeline requires seeing how it connects to events before and after, how it serves as a bridge between the original tragedies that created the first possessed animatronics and the later attempts to contain or destroy those hauntings. The game sits in a fascinating position, released second in the series, but taking place before the first game, showing us a location that existed between the pizzeria, where the original missing children incident occurred, and the location where Mike Schmidt would later work. This temporal placement makes Five Nights at Freddy's 2 crucial for understanding how the possessed animatronics evolved from one location to the next, how William Afton continued his crimes across multiple establishments, and how Fazbear Entertainment's responses to tragedy consistently failed to address underlying problems. Before Five Nights at Freddy's 2, chronologically speaking, there existed earlier Fazbear Entertainment locations where the foundational tragedies occurred. Fredbear's Family Diner operated in the late 70s and early 80s, where Charlotte Emily was murdered by William Afton, becoming the first spirit to possess an animatronic when her essence transferred to the security puppet. At some early Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, possibly the same building that would later be renovated into the 1987 pizzeria, William Afton murdered 5 children in what became known as the Missing Children Incident. The puppet helped these children's spirits possess Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy, creating the hauntings that would define the withered animatronics' behavior throughout Five Nights at Freddy's 2. That location eventually closed. Phone Guy mentions it had been left to rot for quite a while, whether due to the Missing Children Incident or other problems. The animatronics from that location, now carrying the spirits of murdered children, were moved into storage when Fazbear Entertainment decided to try again with a new pizzeria. This is where Five Nights at Freddy's 2 picks up, showing us that new attempt to revive the franchise through modern technology and child-friendly designs. An attempt that failed spectacularly across 1 week in November 1987. The events of Five Nights at Freddy's 2 directly set up the situation Mike Schmidt encounters in the first game. After the 1987 location closed, after the toy animatronics were scrapped, and the withered versions were retained, Fazbear Entertainment eventually reopened at yet another location. This reopening is mentioned in the newspaper at the end of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, described as something that would happen on a smaller budget using the old animatronics. The withered animatronics were refurbished for this reopening, their damaged parts repaired, their exteriors restored to something approximating the condition they'd been in when they were first built. This refurbishment explains why the animatronics in the first game looked relatively intact compared to their withered states in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, despite being the same characters with the same possessed endoskeletons inside. The location where Mike Schmidt works in the original Five Nights at Freddy's is this smaller budget reopening, operating with the refurbished originals as the only performers, no toy animatronics or advanced features, just the classic band doing what they'd always done. Phone Guy notes in the first game that these animatronics have been singing the same stupid songs for 20 years, placing the first game in 1993 or thereabouts. About 6 years after the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the connections between the two games go beyond simple timeline placement. Phone Guy, who guides Jeremy through his week in November 1987, is the same Phone Guy who leaves messages for Mike Schmidt years later. But his tone and circumstances have changed. In Five Nights at Freddy's 2, Phone Guy is relatively upbeat despite the problems, still maintaining hope that things can be managed through proper procedures. By the first game, he sounds more worn down, more aware of danger, still trying to reassure but with less conviction. And crucially, Phone Guy dies during the first game, killed by the animatronics on his fourth night of recording messages for Mike. This confirms he survived the 1987 location's closure, but not the eventual refurbished location's problems. The animatronics that kill him are the same ones Jeremy dealt with years earlier, now refurbished, but still possessed, still hunting, still carrying the trauma and rage of the spirits within them. The Bite of 87, which occurred at the end of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, explains a major policy change Phone Guy mentions in the first game. He notes that the animatronics used to be allowed to walk around during the day, but aren't permitted to do that anymore, that they have to stay on stage during operating hours, a restriction specifically tied to what happened in 87. This restriction is visible in the first game's location, where the animatronics remain on stage during their default positions, only moving at night when the building is closed. The bite forced Fazbear Entertainment to acknowledge that free-roaming animatronics posed too much danger, even if they never publicly admitted the real reason was supernatural possession rather than simple mechanical malfunction. This policy continued affecting how the company operated for years after Jeremy's injury, a rare instance of Fazbear Entertainment actually learning something from tragedy and implementing lasting changes, even if those changes were purely defensive rather than addressing root causes. The puppet's journey through the timeline bridges multiple games. Charlotte's murder predated everything shown in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, occurring at a very early Fazbear Entertainment location. Her possession of the security puppet and subsequent actions helping other children possess animatronics created the foundation for all later hauntings. During the 1987 location shown in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the puppet was moved along with the old animatronics, stored in the prize corner where Jeremy had to keep its music box wound to prevent its approach. The puppet survived the closure, wasn't scrapped with the toy animatronics. Some combination of Charlotte's importance to the overall haunting ecosystem and Fazbear Entertainment, not recognizing what the puppet actually was meant, it got packed away rather than destroyed. The puppet appears in later games, including Five Nights at Freddy's 3, as one of the hallucinations in Fazbear's Fright, suggesting it remained tied to Fazbear Entertainment's assets through multiple location changes. Eventually, in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, Henry Emily designs an animatronic called Lefty specifically to capture the puppet. Recognizing his daughter's spirit needs to be freed, this long arc from Charlotte's death through her possession and guidance of other spirits to her eventual capture and release spans the entire franchise, with Five Nights at Freddy's 2 showing a crucial middle point where Charlotte, as the puppet, witnessed more murders and tried futilely to help more victims. William Afton's progression through the timeline centers Five Nights at Freddy's 2 as a crucial moment in his development as a serial killer. He'd already murdered Charlotte and the original 5 missing children before the game's events, establishing his pattern of using Fazbear Entertainment locations as hunting grounds. The Save the minigame depicts deaths at the FNAF 2 location, showing a purple figure consistent with Afton's representation throughout the series, though whether these deaths represent entirely new victims during November 1987 or depict the original missing children incident from another perspective remains debated in the community. Regardless of the exact timeline interpretation, Afton's use of the yellow spring Bonnie suit to gain children's trust, his ability to operate within Fazbear Entertainment locations while evading detection, and his continued killing despite the previous location's closure, all demonstrated his sophistication as a predator. The fact that deaths occurred at the 1987 location while it was under police investigation shows either remarkable boldness or insight into how ineffective those investigations would be at actually catching him. After this location closed, Afton continued evading justice, eventually meeting his end years later when he returned to the abandoned original location to dismantle the animatronics and was cornered by the spirits of his victims. That death, shown in Five Nights at Freddy's 3's minigames, wouldn't have been possible without the hauntings that started with Charlotte, making Five Nights at Freddy's 2's depiction of Afton's continued activity crucial to understanding how his eventual fate came about. Five Nights at Freddy's 2's position as a prequel that was released second created interesting metatextual implications for how fans experience the franchise's lore. Players who started with the first game learned about the Bite of 87, the missing children, the possessions, all as historical events referenced but not shown. When Five Nights at Freddy's Tseku revealed it took place in 1987, those players suddenly realized they were about to experience the events leading to that infamous bite, to witness the week when tragedy struck. This created a sense of dramatic irony where players knew something terrible was coming, but the characters living through those events didn't. Jeremy Fitzgerald approached his shifts each night, not knowing he'd become famous as the victim of one of the franchise's most discussed incidents. Phone Guy recorded his helpful messages, not realizing that this location would close within the week and that he'd die in a similar location years later. The children attending that final birthday party had no idea one of them would witness an animatronic attack that removed someone's frontal lobe. Only the players, armed with knowledge from the first game, understood that the bright new pizzeria with its advanced technology and safety promises was doomed from the start. This narrative structure, showing the past after establishing the present, became a hallmark of the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, with later games continuing to jump around in time rather than following a linear chronology. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 established that pattern, proving that understanding this series required piecing together a puzzle where the pieces were deliberately given out of order. Conclusion: the week that defined a franchise. As we reach the end of this journey through Five Nights at Freddy's 2's complete lore, as the last echoes of music boxes and animatronic footsteps fade into the quiet, we're left contemplating a week in November 1987 that contained more tragedy, horror, and revelation than most franchises manage across their entire runs. From Jeremy Fitzgerald's first nervous night watching toy animatronics on security cameras to his final day shift at a birthday party that would change him forever, from Charlotte Emily's continued attempts to help murdered children find vessels for their spirits to William Afton's ruthless continuation of his killing spree, from Phone Guy's well-intentioned but inadequate guidance to the institutional failures that enabled every tragedy shown in the game, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 presented a complete microcosm of everything that made this franchise compelling. It showed us how hope and horror could coexist, how modern technology and ancient evil could occupy the same space, how people trying their best to survive could still fall victim to forces beyond their control or understanding. The tragedy of Five Nights at Freddy's 2 isn't just what happened to specific characters, though Jeremy's injury and the deaths of 5 more children certainly qualify as profound personal tragedies. The deeper tragedy is how preventable everything was, how many warning signs existed that were ignored or downplayed, how institutional priorities consistently ranked profit and reputation over human safety. The toy animatronics showed aggressive behavior towards staff from the beginning, but the pizzeria stayed open. The withered animatronics moved at night despite being powered down, but no one investigated why or implemented better containment. An ongoing police investigation suggested serious problems, but operations continued with minimal changes. Phone Guy delivered warnings, but framed them as manageable quirks rather than immediate dangers. And when tragedy finally occurred, when an animatronic attacked during a party and a security guard lost part of his brain, Fazbear Entertainment's response was to close that location, scrap the implicated animatronics, and plan to reopen elsewhere with minimal changes to their business model. The pattern that would define the entire franchise: danger ignored until tragedy strikes, then damage control rather than meaningful reform, was established or at least reinforced by the events of this 1 week in one location. Yet for all its darkness, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 also showed moments of attempted protection and care, however inadequate or misguided. Charlotte, as the puppet tried to help children, tried to guide spirits towards some form of continued existence, tried to lead withered Freddy to discover bodies in hopes of preventing more deaths, She failed, couldn't stop William Afton or save the children while they were alive, but she tried. That effort, born from her own trauma and death, represented something important in a franchise often defined by futility and horror. Phone Guy genuinely wanted Jeremy to survive, offered advice that proved helpful even if he couldn't acknowledge how serious the danger truly was. He was constrained by corporate loyalty and perhaps his own inability to fully accept how bad things had gotten. But he cared enough to record those messages, to try preparing night guards for what they'd face. Even Jeremy himself, by showing up each night despite the terror, by following instructions even when they seemed questionable, demonstrated a kind of courage or determination or simple need for employment that made him sympathetic rather than simply a player avatar. These small human moments, these attempts to help or survive or just do a job, provided contrast to the supernatural evil and institutional negligence that defined most of the game's narrative. The lore of Five Nights at Freddy's 2 expanded the franchise's mythology in crucial ways, introducing the puppet and Charlotte story, showing William Afton continuing to kill across multiple locations, revealing how possessed animatronics could be moved from place to place while retaining their hauntings, establishing the Bite of 87 as a concrete event with a likely victim, and demonstrating that Fazbear Entertainment's problems weren't limited to one bad location or one set of circumstances. The game proved that the horror was systemic, that as long as William Afton remained free and Fazbear Entertainment remained operational, more tragedies would occur. It showed the franchise's timeline was more complex than simple linear progression, that understanding what happened required looking at events out of order, and it established themes of institutional failure, cyclical violence, and the persistence of trauma that would continue developing through later games. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 wasn't just a prequel showing earlier events. It was a crucial foundational text that later installments would build upon, reference, and expand. For players experiencing this lore for the first time, whether through gameplay or videos or explanations like this one, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 offers an entry point into a franchise that rewards careful attention and thoughtful interpretation. Its story works on multiple levels. As a survival horror game, it delivers tension and scares through well-designed mechanics and atmosphere. As a workplace horror story, it examines how vulnerable employees can be when working for negligent employers. As a supernatural tragedy, it explores possession, trauma, and the persistence of spirits seeking justice or peace. And as a piece of a larger puzzle, it provides crucial information about characters, events, and themes that span multiple games and years of timeline. Understanding Five Nights at Freddy's 2 means understanding a significant portion of what makes this franchise work, why it captured imaginations and generated endless discussion and theorizing despite its simple presentation and minimal explicit storytelling. As we close this deep dive into the lore of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, as we leave Jeremy Fitzgerald to whatever fate befell him after that final day shift, whether he was the bite victim as evidence suggests, or simply another employee who survived to tell the tale, as we acknowledge Charlotte Emily's ongoing vigil over children who needed protection she couldn't provide, as we recognize William Afton continuing his murders unimpeded by justice or consequence, we're left with the knowledge that this week in November 1987 was both a discrete chapter and part of an ongoing story. The pizzeria closed, but the spirits remained. The toy animatronics were scrapped, but the withered originals survived to be refurbished and hunt again. Jeremy's injury healed to the extent it could, but the trauma persisted. The children who died found some form of existence in animatronic shells, but not peace. Phone Guy survived this location only to die at a later one. And Fazbear Entertainment continued operating, opening new locations, exposing new people to danger, perpetuating cycles of violence that started long before this game and would continue long after. Thank you for staying with this exploration all the way to the end, for letting these dark tales of possessed machines and murdered children wash over you in this quiet hour. If you enjoyed this comprehensive dive into Five Nights at Freddy's 2's complete lore, feel free to like and subscribe for more deep lore explanations delivered in this slow, contemplative style. And remember, whether you're processing this during waking hours or letting it carry you towards sleep, the story we've traced tonight is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. 1 week in a decades-long timeline of tragedy and horror that defines Five Nights at Freddy's. Sweet dreams, and may your nights be free of music boxes winding down and animatronics hunting in the dark.